My name is Madison, and I am 33 years old. While I lay unconscious in the intensive care unit, my parents quietly sold my house, my jewelry, and everything that defined my hard-earned life, conducting themselves as though I had already drawn my last breath. But they had absolutely no idea about the secret door concealed behind my kitchen wall. And what I had hidden there would turn their entire carefully constructed world upside down the moment I opened my eyes. Waking up from a 3-week coma is nothing like falling asleep and simply opening your eyes. It is a violent, disorienting tear back into reality. The harsh, sterile, fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit blinded me the instant my eyelids parted. The rhythmic, mechanical hissing of the ventilator had been my only companion in the darkness, and my throat burned like swallowed shards of glass from the recently removed breathing tube. I tried to move my arms, but my muscles felt like they had been filled with lead. The last thing I remembered was a business lunch with a wealthy client, tasting a new seafood dish, and then the sudden, terrifying closure of my airway, anaphylactic shock, severe, swift, and completely unforgiving. As a high-end estate liquidator, I was accustomed to being in absolute control at all times. My daily life consisted of appraising multi-million-dollar properties, cataloging rare antiques, and negotiating with ruthless heirs locked in bitter battles over inherited fortunes. I made decisions that moved millions of dollars with a single signature. Yet lying in that hospital bed, stripped of everything, I was completely and utterly powerless. I pressed the call button with a trembling finger, my mind already racing. Where was my mother, Cynthia? Where was my father, Richard? They should have been pacing the waiting room, demanding constant updates from the medical staff, performing their roles as devoted suburban parents the way they always did at their exclusive country club. A nurse hurried into the room. Her name tag read Brenda, and her eyes widened in visible shock when she saw me attempting to sit up. She rushed to my side, checking my vitals on the monitor, her hands fluttering anxiously over the wires attached to my chest. "You are awake," she whispered, as though she had just witnessed something impossible. "You are actually awake." "Where is my family?" I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel scraping against pavement. "Did someone call my parents?" Brenda froze. The professional, comforting smile vanished from her face entirely, replaced by a look of deep, uncomfortable pity. She looked down at her clipboard, avoiding my gaze. It was the same expression I had seen on the faces of distant relatives the moment they realized they had been cut out of a wealthy uncle's will. It was the unmistakable look of someone holding a terrible, ugly truth they desperately did not want to deliver. "Where are they, Brenda?" I demanded, forcing myself up onto my elbows despite the agonizing pain radiating through my chest. She hesitated, biting her lip, before slowly reaching into a folder at the foot of my bed. "I think you need to see this," she said quietly. She handed me a thick stack of legal papers bearing the hospital's official letterhead. I squinted at the text, my vision still slightly blurred from the heavy medications flooding my system. It was a medical directive form, a refusal of care document. "Your parents were here last week," Brenda explained, her voice trembling slightly. "They met with the hospital administration. They claimed that your medical bills were draining their personal resources and that you had no realistic chance of a meaningful recovery. They signed these papers to formally refuse any financial responsibility for your ongoing care. And they officially requested that we withdraw life support." The words punched the breath out of my lungs. Withdraw life support. Pull the plug. My own parents. I stared at their familiar signatures at the bottom of the page. Cynthia's elegant, looping cursive. Richard's hurried, careless scrawl. They had signed away my life without flinching. "But I am breathing," I choked out, gripping the paper so hard my knuckles turned white. "I am alive." The hospital ethics committee intervened. Brenda said quickly, Your brain scans showed sustained neurological activity. Our chief of neurology refused to comply with their request because you were showing microscopic but measurable signs of improvement. We attempted to contact them 2 days ago to update them on your progress, but every number they had provided was disconnected. They completely washed their hands of you. A cold, sharp realization pierced through the fog of my medication. My parents were vain, deeply selfish people. My mother was drowning in credit card debt to maintain appearances with her wealthy social circle, and my father was far too weak and compliant to ever challenge her. They had always favored my younger sister, Savannah, treating her like royalty while viewing my fierce independence as some kind of personal threat. But to actively attempt to end my life, that meant something else entirely. That meant there was a massive financial incentive driving every single decision they had made. "I need a phone," I said, my voice suddenly dropping to a deadly calm. The shock was immediately replaced by the ruthless, analytical mindset that had made me the best in my industry. "Give me your phone. Right now." Brenda looked startled but pulled her smartphone from her scrubs pocket and placed it in my hand. I did not hesitate for even a second. I opened the browser and typed in the web address for my primary bank. My fingers were bruised and uncoordinated, missing the keys twice before finally managing to enter my secure login credentials. I was a woman who reviewed her portfolios every single morning before her first cup of coffee. I knew exactly what my net worth was down to the last cent. Emergency funds, business accounts, personal savings, all of it built with my own blood, sweat, and relentless determination. The banking dashboard loaded. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs it triggered an alarm on the monitor beside my bed. Available balance, $0. I frantically clicked into my business checking account. $0. My high-yield savings account. $0. Even my emergency medical fund had been completely and systematically drained. Every single account wiped clean with surgical precision. They had used a fraudulent power of attorney. They had taken absolutely everything. A sick, nauseating dread washed over me as a second thought struck. If they had access to my liquid assets, they had access to everything else. I opened a new tab and navigated to Zillow. My hands shook violently as I typed in the address of my beautifully restored $1.2 million historic home. The home I had spent 3 years meticulously renovating from top to bottom with my own vision and my own money. The page loaded, and the bright red text across the top of the listing landed like a physical blow. Sold. Closed. 4 days ago. I dropped the phone onto the hospital blanket. While I was fighting for every single breath in a medically induced coma, my family had not simply abandoned me to die. They had stripped my carcass bare. They had stolen my life savings and sold my sanctuary to the highest bidder, discarding me like a piece of worthless trash. But as the initial wave of devastation began to recede, a dark, dangerous smile slowly crept across my face. They thought they had taken everything. They thought I was just a sad, solitary woman who hoarded old furniture and sentimental clutter. They had absolutely no idea that the house they had just sold under fraudulent terms did not even belong to me personally. And they had no clue whatsoever about the titanium-reinforced vault hidden behind my kitchen wall. I gripped the borrowed phone so tightly the plastic casing creaked under the pressure. I did not waste a single moment on tears. Tears were a luxury reserved for people who still carried hope, and I had none left for these people. I dialed my mother's number from memory. It rang twice before she picked up. Loud chatter and the sharp, high-pitched clinking of crystal champagne glasses flooded through the speaker. She was at the country club, while I was lying in a hospital gown smelling of antiseptic and medical-grade adhesive. My mother was day-drinking with her socialite friends. "Hello?" Cynthia answered, her voice bright and effortlessly bubbly. "Mom," I said, "it is Madison." The background noise seemed to halt entirely on her end. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the receiver. Maddie. She sounded irritated. Not relieved, not stunned, not overcome with guilt. Simply irritated, as though I had interrupted something far more important. Is that why you emptied my bank accounts? I demanded, my voice cutting cleanly through the quiet hospital room. Is that why my house is listed as sold on Zillow? Cynthia did not miss a single beat. Her tone shifted instantly, shedding the country club sweetness and reverting to her usual condescending authority. Keep your voice down, she snapped. Do not be so dramatic, Madison. We had to make executive decisions. You were on life support and the bills were piling up by the hour. You signed a refusal of care document, I shot back, my fury crystallizing into something far more precise and dangerous. You attempted to pull my life support in order to secure your theft. You forged a medical power of attorney to bypass probate court entirely. It was not forged, Cynthia scoffed defensively. We are your parents. We had every right to step in when you were incapacitated. And frankly, you should be thanking us. We saved this family from complete ruin. Andre made some bad investments. My brother-in-law, Andre, the arrogant finance personality who relentlessly mocked my estate liquidation business while boasting about his cryptocurrency portfolio. He had married my younger sister Savannah 3 years ago, and my parents worshipped the ground he walked on with a devotion they had never once extended to me. Andre got hit with a massive margin call, Cynthia continued, her voice laced with righteous indignation, as though I were the one creating an inconvenience. He was going to lose everything, Madison, everything. His firm would have terminated him over his personal debt exposure. Savannah was absolutely hysterical. You know how fragile your sister is. She needs funding for her IVF treatments. She deserves to be a mother. She deserves a beautiful, stable life, free from financial stress. And what about my life? I asked, my voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. Cynthia released a long, heavy sigh, pure exasperation packaged as maternal patience. Let us be realistic, Maddie. You are 33 years old and you are single. You spend your days sifting through dead people's belongings. You do not have a husband. You do not have children. You did not need a $1.2 million house entirely to yourself. Savannah is building a real family. Andre is a financial genius who simply hit a temporary rough patch in the market. We redirected your assets to cover his margin call and protect their future. Consider it your contribution to this family. We all have to do our part. I listened to the woman who had given birth to me calmly justify dismantling my entire existence, stripping away everything I had built over a decade, in order to fund my sister's designer lifestyle and her husband's reckless financial gambling. They had literally sold the roof over my head to pay off cryptocurrency debts. They viewed my hard-earned assets as nothing more than a personal reserve fund for their golden child. You sold my house, I repeated, allowing the words to hang in the air between us. We found a cash buyer, Cynthia said, her voice carrying a note of unmistakable pride. A house flipper who needed the lot quickly. We offered him a competitive price to close in 4 days. The money has already been transferred. Andre used it to secure his accounts, and Savannah has already booked her first fertility clinic appointment. So please do not ruin this moment by throwing one of your tantrums. You can stay in our guest room when they discharge you. We will help you find a nice, affordable little apartment somewhere suitable. Now I really must go. The club is serving lunch and Savannah is waiting for me. We are celebrating our fresh start. Cynthia hung up. I slowly lowered the phone. The screen faded to black. The sheer audacity. The absolute monstrous entitlement. They were toasting my presumed death with champagne purchased with my own money. They believed they had outmaneuvered me completely. That because I was the unmarried sister without a glamorous finance career, I was an easy, uncomplicated target. Brenda, The nurse stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of careful caution. "Honey, you need to lie back down. Your heart rate is spiking dangerously." I ignored her entirely. I threw off the thin hospital blanket. The cool air hit my bare legs, but I did not register the chill. A sudden surge of adrenaline flooded my veins, temporarily masking the persistent pain in my chest. I grabbed the IV line taped to the back of my hand. "Ma'am, please do not," Brenda warned, stepping closer. I pulled the needle out in one clean, swift motion. A single drop of blood landed on the pristine white linoleum floor. I did not flinch. I tossed the plastic tubing onto the mattress and swung my legs over the side of the bed. "I need my clothes," I said. "You cannot leave," Brenda pleaded, her voice climbing with panic. "You just woke up from a coma. You are medically unstable." "I am calling the doctor right now." "Call whoever you need to call," I replied, reaching for my personal belongings bag from the plastic bin in the corner. "But I am checking out against medical advice. My family just declared war, and I refuse to fight it from a hospital bed." I pulled out my own cell phone, which had been powered off inside the bag. I turned it on, ignoring the cascade of missed notifications from clients and contractors alike. I bypassed every single one of them and dialed the only number that mattered in this moment. Harrison. My former employer, a razor-sharp attorney, and the single most ruthless person in this city, with the possible exception of me. He answered on the first ring. "Madison, where the hell have you been? I have been trying to reach you for 3 weeks." "I was in a coma," I stated flatly, pulling myself into my jeans with shaking hands. "My parents attempted to pull my life support while I was unconscious. Then they used a forged power of attorney to drain every one of my bank accounts and sell my house to a cash buyer, all to cover Andre's cryptocurrency margin calls." Silence on the other end. Then a low, slow, dangerous chuckle. Harrison was not horrified. He was genuinely intrigued. "Those idiots actually sold your house." "They believe they did," I replied, dragging my shirt over my head. "I need you to come pick me up from the general hospital right now. Bring your laptop." "I am on my way," Harrison said without hesitation. "Should I begin preparing a civil suit for the stolen funds?" "No," I answered, walking out of the hospital room while Brenda called loudly for security behind me. Civil suits take far too long and leave far too much room for sympathy. We are going straight for federal criminal charges. They believe they sold my personal property. They have no idea this house is legally owned by Apex Estate LLC, a company I incorporated entirely offshore for privacy and asset protection purposes. They just committed wire fraud and title theft across state lines. Every count is a federal felony. "And the buyer?" Harrison asked. "Some amateur house flipper looking for a fast turnaround," I said, stepping into the elevator. "He probably thinks he scored the deal of a lifetime. He is about to receive a very unpleasant surprise. They sold him the walls and the roof, but they completely missed the real prize." I looked down at my left wrist, running my thumb over the small, imperceptible bump resting just beneath the skin. As an estate liquidator handling multi-million-dollar assets on a daily basis, I had always taken my personal security with extreme seriousness. "They do not know about the vault hidden behind the kitchen wall," I told Harrison as the elevator doors slid shut. "And they absolutely do not know that the only key capable of opening it is a biometric microchip implanted directly under my skin. Let them drink their champagne today. By tomorrow, they would be begging for mercy." Harrison pulled his black SUV up to the hospital entrance. I practically fell into the passenger seat, still wearing hospital scrub pants and a borrowed oversized hoodie. I looked like a walking corpse, pale, bruised, and operating on pure adrenaline and controlled fury. But my mind had never been sharper in my entire life. "Drive to the house," I commanded. Harrison accelerated immediately. He attempted to hand me a cup of coffee, but I waved it off. I needed the rage, clean and undiluted, to carry me through what came next. When we turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street, the devastation struck me with physical force. A massive commercial dumpster sat on my carefully manicured front lawn, crushing the hydrangeas I had planted the previous spring. The heavy, rhythmic thud of sledgehammers echoed through the open front door. Clouds of demolition dust billowed out through the windows like smoke rising from a war zone. I did not wait for Harrison to come to a full stop. I threw the car door open and marched straight up the driveway, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my chest from the torn-out IV site. I pushed through the front door into the foyer. My beautiful custom oak floors were buried beneath industrial tarps and scattered drywall debris. Two contractors were violently dismantling the floating staircase I had imported from Italy at considerable expense and personal pride. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking as the thick dust coated my already raw throat. "Stop tearing apart my house." A man stepped out from what had once been my formal dining room. He wore a tight polo shirt, mirrored sunglasses resting on the back of his neck, and carried the kind of smug grin that makes blood boil on contact. He looked exactly like every arrogant amateur house flipper I had ever encountered in the estate liquidation business, the kind of man who watches a handful of renovation reality shows and immediately declares himself a real estate mogul, fully prepared to gut irreplaceable historic architecture for the sake of a fast profit margin. "Whoa, easy there," he said, stepping directly into my path and holding up both hands with exaggerated patience. "You cannot be in here. This is an active construction site." "This is my property," I snarled, attempting to push past him toward the kitchen. "I need to retrieve my personal belongings immediately." He shoved me backward, hard. My weakened legs buckled instantly, and I hit the dusty floor, scraping both palms raw against the exposed floorboards. Harrison rushed in behind me and grabbed the flipper firmly by the collar. "Touch my client again and you will be consuming your meals through a straw," Harrison said, his voice dangerously quiet. The flipper yanked himself free, dusting off his shirt with a theatrical eye roll. "Client?" he scoffed, looking down at me sprawled on the floor. "Is that what you call this lunatic? Look, lady, your parents already warned me you might show up making a scene. They sold this place to me free and clear 4 days ago. Cash deal, fast close. So get out before I call the police for trespassing." I rose slowly, brushing the drywall dust from my borrowed hoodie. "My parents had no legal right to sell this property," I said, my voice settling into lethal calm. "You purchased a stolen house." The flipper let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed through the gutted space. "Sure I did. Listen, your mother told me everything about you. Said you were bankrupt, begged them to bail you out of a mountain of debt. So they sold this place to cover your liabilities and fund your sister's IVF. Honestly, you should be thanking them. They gave me a steep discount to move this toxic asset quickly. Said you were a complete failure who hoarded old junk." Old junk. My fists clenched so tightly my fingernails cut into my palms. I was a high-end estate liquidator. I managed multi-million-dollar asset distributions for some of the most elite clients in the country. I knew the precise value of every single component of this house down to the individual fixtures. My eyes moved past his face, scanning the destruction methodically. The living room was entirely gutted. The dining room walls were stripped to the studs, but then my gaze landed on the kitchen, and specifically on the back wall, the one covered in hand-selected imported Italian subway tiles. It stood completely untouched. The contractors had demolished everything surrounding it with apparent enthusiasm, but that specific partition remained perfectly intact. I knew exactly why. That wall was not standard drywall. Concealed beneath those decorative tiles was a heat-resistant, reinforced titanium steel core, custom installed by specialists I had hired specifically to house the biometric vault. Standard sledgehammers would bounce harmlessly off the surface, sending shockwaves back up the arms of anyone foolish enough to strike it. Just as I registered this, a heavy-set contractor walked into the kitchen carrying a massive industrial pneumatic demolition hammer. He adjusted his safety goggles, planted his boots firmly, and aimed the heavy steel bit directly at the center of the tiled wall, the exact location where the biometric scanner was concealed beneath the grout. If that pneumatic drill breached the outer casing, it would trigger the secondary lockdown protocol, permanently sealing the vault and the $4 million in client assets stored inside it. My heart stopped. I lunged forward, shoving the flipper out of my path with a sudden burst of pure adrenaline. "Wait!" I screamed, my voice tearing through the dusty air. "Do not touch that wall." The contractor paused, the heavy drill hovering inches from the tile surface. The flipper crossed his arms and fixed me with a hard stare. Why exactly should he stop? I own this property. Tear it down. I turned to face the flipper directly, my eyes blazing with cold, calculated intensity. Because that specific wall contains a heavily concentrated toxic asbestos core. The lie left my lips without a fraction of hesitation. My company had it sealed and encapsulated 5 years ago as part of the renovation remediation process. You strike that wall with a pneumatic drill, and you will release a lethal cloud of carcinogens directly into this residential neighborhood. You will not simply face millions in environmental cleanup fines. You will be looking at federal prison for hazardous endangerment. The heavy-set contractor immediately released the demolition hammer and took 3 large steps back from the tiles, as though the wall had just revealed itself to be a biological weapon. The smug grin on the flipper's face evaporated completely, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. He stumbled backward, his face draining of all color, pulling his mirrored sunglasses down with trembling fingers. "Asbestos?" he stammered. "Are you out of your mind? I did not authorize hazardous material removal. I am not absorbing a federal cleanup liability for this property." He waved frantically at the heavy-set contractor who was already retreating from the wall as though it were rigged to detonate. "Everybody get outside, right now. I am calling the city inspector and my environmental consultant. If she is lying, I am suing her for project delay damages." He stormed through the front door, phone already pressed to his ear, with his crew scrambling out right behind him and leaving a fresh cloud of drywall dust hanging in their wake. Harrison stepped immediately into the entryway, planting himself in the doorframe with crossed arms to ensure they remained outside. "You have exactly 3 minutes," he called over his shoulder, keeping both eyes trained on the driveway. "Make it count before that man realizes you were bluffing." I did not waste a single second. I scrambled over the demolished remains of my custom kitchen island, ignoring the sharp sting of broken marble fragments cutting through my hospital socks. I moved directly toward the pristine tiled wall beneath the heavy stainless steel range hood. To anyone else in the world, it looked like a sophisticated high-end backsplash. Nothing more, nothing less. To me, it was the gateway to my survival. I reached up under the lip of the ventilation hood, tracing my fingers along the cold metal until I located the small, hidden indentation. I pressed the inside of my left wrist firmly against the concealed biometric scanner. A quiet, electronic beep sounded, followed by the deep, satisfying mechanical hum of heavy internal gears engaging. The grout lines between the subway tiles split cleanly and precisely down the center. The wall panels separated, sliding smoothly and silently along hidden internal tracks, revealing a heavy vault door constructed from blast-resistant steel. I gripped the chrome handle, rotated it, and pulled the heavy door open, stepping into the climate-controlled sanctuary I had designed and built specifically for my business operations. The air inside was perfectly chilled and carried the rich, reassuring scent of leather and polished metal. The interior was completely, miraculously untouched by the chaos and destruction consuming the rest of the house. I flipped the light switch, illuminating the secure interior shelving. My personal safety net sat on the bottom rack exactly where I had left it. $2 million in banded cash alongside certified gold bars, stacked with meticulous, almost meditative precision. It represented an emergency fund built over a full decade of ruthless negotiations and flawlessly executed estate liquidations. But my personal wealth was not the reason my heart was hammering so forcefully in my chest. I looked to the top shelf, where a series of velvet-lined mahogany display cases rested in perfect security. I unlatched the largest case and released a long, sharp breath of pure relief. Nestled inside on custom silk cushions was a pristine collection of vintage Patek Philippe timepieces, grand complications, perpetual calendars, and minute repeaters spanning 5 extraordinary decades of horological mastery. They belonged to an eccentric billionaire client who had entrusted them to my firm for a highly confidential authentication and private liquidation process. The collection was conservatively valued at $4 million. If that arrogant house flipper, or my greedy parents, had managed to breach this vault and move these pieces through any secondary market, it would not simply be a family dispute. It would be a catastrophic federal crime. Stealing and fencing $4 million of a billionaire's entrusted assets across state lines was a guaranteed one-way path to federal prison for every person involved. The trap had been set with beautiful, unintentional precision, but I needed one final piece. I moved to the rear of the vault, where a sleek black security terminal hummed quietly in the corner. I had installed high-definition cameras directly into the kitchen lighting fixtures, feeding encrypted footage to this local hard drive. I tapped the keyboard, brought the monitor to life, and navigated to the surveillance archive. I pulled up the exact date and time of my medical emergency 3 weeks prior. My fingers trembled slightly as I pressed play. The high-resolution color footage filled the screen. I watched myself standing at the kitchen island, sipping a glass of water after returning from that seafood lunch. I watched the precise moment the anaphylactic shock took hold. On screen, I dropped the glass, shattering it across the floor. I grabbed at my throat, my face turning a terrifying shade of purple as my airway swelled completely shut. I collapsed, gasping for air, writhing in absolute agony against the tile. Then the front door opened in the footage. Cynthia and Richard walked in. I watched my own mother and father pause in the kitchen doorway, looking directly at their eldest daughter suffocating on the floor below them. They did not reach for their phones. Cynthia did not scream for help or kneel beside me. Instead, she calmly turned back toward the entrance and waved someone inside. A man with a briefcase, a fraudulent notary, hurried into the frame. Richard quickly extracted a stack of legal documents, the power of attorney forms and the property deed transfer papers. I watched in cold, paralyzed horror as my father knelt beside my convulsing body. While I was actively dying, choking against my own swollen airway, Richard lifted my flaccid hand, pressed my thumb firmly against an ink pad, and then forced my thumbprint onto the signature lines of every single document, one after another. Cynthia stood over both of us, pointing precisely to each spot requiring authorization, her face completely devoid of any maternal concern or human emotion whatsoever. They waited until the ink was fully dry. They waited until the fraudulent notary had packed his briefcase and slipped out through the back. Only then, only after they had successfully transferred my entire life into their possession and secured my assets for Savannah and Andre, did Cynthia finally lift her phone and dial emergency services. I paused the video on Cynthia's face, the final remaining trace of familial love I had been unconsciously preserving somewhere deep within me, turned to ice and dissolved completely. This was not desperate greed dressed up as parental duty. This was not a family making impossible choices under pressure. They had intentionally, deliberately delayed my medical rescue in order to orchestrate a massive financial fraud while I lay dying on my own kitchen floor. It was attempted murder, expertly disguised as a tragic accident. I inserted a secure flash drive into the terminal port and downloaded the complete video file alongside high-resolution screenshots, capturing the fraudulent notary's face and the forged documents in sharp, irrefutable detail. I slipped the drive into my hoodie pocket, sealed the vault, and watched the titanium door lock with a deep, resonant metallic thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The decorative tiles realigned flawlessly, concealing every trace of the seam behind them. But this time, I did not leave it perfect. I picked up a heavy steel crowbar one of the contractors had abandoned on the floor. I swung it deliberately, striking the edge of the marble countertop directly adjacent to the hidden wall. The impact sent a jagged crack racing up the drywall, slightly exposing the gleaming edge of the titanium casing beneath the tiles. A small, calculated flaw, barely visible. But to a profit-hungry house flipper searching for structural anomalies to justify his renovation plans, it would be completely irresistible. I set the crowbar down and dusted off my hands. "I left a breadcrumb," I told Harrison as I walked back into the entryway. "That flipper is going to return tomorrow with a city inspector to prove I was lying about the asbestos. When the air tests come back clean, he will order demolition to resume. His crew will strike that exposed titanium edge. They will realize there is a massive hidden vault inside a house they just purchased with stolen money. And being the greedy, impulsive amateur that he is, he will attempt to breach it, triggering my secondary silent alarm directly to the local police precinct and the FBI field office." Harrison stared at me for a long moment, shaking his head with something that looked very much like genuine awe. "You are genuinely terrifying, Madison." "Good," I replied, pulling my hood up. "Now let us go. I have a federal trap to finalize, and my family has a great deal of stolen money left to spend before the cage snaps permanently shut around them." Harrison drove me to a roadside motel on the furthest outskirts of the city and paid for a room in cash. It smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaning product, a jarring, deeply unpleasant contrast to the pristine imported Italian marble of my stolen home. But for now, this dingy, anonymous space was my temporary war room, and it would serve its purpose perfectly. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress with Harrison's salvaged laptop open in front of me, tethered to a burner phone he had purchased on the drive over. My fingers moved across the keyboard as I logged into a ghost social media account I maintained specifically for conducting background checks on high-net-worth clients. Tonight, however, my target was my own blood. I typed Savannah into the search bar. She was broadcasting live. She always was. The screen loaded and my sister filled the display, practically glowing. Her blonde hair freshly blown out in perfect waves, wearing a silk designer blouse that cost more than the room I was currently occupying. She was squealing into the camera, surrounded by a sea of distinctive orange boxes arranged across a large mahogany dining table. "Guys, you will not believe what Andre just surprised me with," Savannah exclaimed to her audience, pressing one hand over her mouth in an expression of theatrical shock. She carefully lifted a large fabric dust bag from the biggest box on the table, drawing out the reveal with practiced precision. A genuine Hermes Birkin in Togo leather, gold, with palladium hardware. "It is my push present for our IVF journey," she announced breathlessly, running her fingertips along the immaculate stitching for the camera. Before she could finish the display, my mother Cynthia pushed her way into the frame, martini glass in one hand and a set of shiny black car keys in the other, angling them deliberately so the Porsche crest caught the light for maximum effect. "Do not forget who upgraded her vehicle today," Cynthia announced with beaming satisfaction. "A brand new Panamera. We are finally putting the dark times behind us and focusing entirely on family blessings." I watched them celebrate, toasting with my money, wearing my money, driving my money, and I felt nothing but the cold, crystalline clarity of absolute purpose. I closed the laptop carefully, set it on the nightstand, and lay back on the sagging mattress in the dark. Let them have tonight. By morning, everything they believed they had secured would begin to unravel. Slowly at first, then all at once. And I would be the one holding every single thread. I watched my mother sip her drink, her eyes crinkling with absolute unguarded joy. There was not a single trace of a woman in mourning, no grief, no guilt, no hollow absence where a conscience should have been. Her eldest daughter was supposed to be dying on a ventilator just a few miles away in the intensive care unit, and Cynthia looked as though she had never been happier in her entire life. They were not simply spending my money, they were actively, joyfully celebrating my erasure from the world. The camera shifted abruptly as a tall, broad-shouldered man walked into the frame, wrapping a heavy arm possessively around Savannah's waist. Andre, my brother-in-law, wore a custom-fitted linen suit that announced new money with every thread, and the smug expression on his face made my jaw clench the instant I saw it. He leaned into the camera, holding up a glass of expensive amber scotch and swirling the ice cubes with a practiced, theatrical flick of his wrist. "You have to know when to strike," Andre announced, his voice soaked in the kind of finance bro arrogance that makes reasonable people want to leave the room. Everybody else was panicking in the market this week. Everybody was online crying about the crypto winter and liquidation cascades. But true sharks do not panic. We smell blood in the water, and we buy the dip. It is all about the alpha mindset. You leverage your assets. You hold with diamond hands, and you take absolute, unwavering control of your financial destiny. I just injected massive liquidity into my portfolio precisely when the weak hands were selling. And now, we are reaping the rewards. Generational wealth is built in the bear market, baby. I stared at the glowing screen and let out a dark, hollow laugh that bounced flatly off the cheap motel walls. Generational wealth. Alpha mindset. What a pathetic, disgusting joke. I knew exactly what Andre's portfolio looked like, because I had retained a private investigator to examine his trading firm months ago, the first time he had come to me with his hand outstretched, asking for a personal loan. Andre was not a shark. He was a degenerate gambler playing recklessly with heavily leveraged cryptocurrency positions. He had been struck with a catastrophic margin call the previous week, and his brokers were actively threatening to liquidate his entire underwater position and pursue him personally for the resulting negative balance. He had not bought the dip. He had stolen my $1.2 million house, liquidated it for quick, desperate cash, and pumped my entire life savings directly into his failing trading accounts simply to avoid personal bankruptcy and the federal scrutiny that would inevitably follow. And here he stood, parading across a live stream, performing the role of a self-made titan of industry, using the exact money he had stolen while I lay suffocating and convulsing on my own kitchen floor. The camera panned across the room as Savannah turned to display her new designer bag to someone seated just off-screen. For a single fraction of a second, the background snapped into perfect sharp focus. I recognized the distinctive hand-painted emerald wallpaper. I recognized the arched mahogany doorways and the massive crystal chandelier suspended dramatically from the ceiling. They were not celebrating at home. They were inside the exclusive private dining room of the Oakmont Country Club, the most pretentious and financially catastrophic establishment in the entire state. A place where my mother had spent the better part of her adult life, desperately manufacturing an image of wealth and refinement. They were surrounded by their wealthy friends and Andre's business partners, spinning an elaborate fairy tale about his brilliant investment instincts and the family's sudden, righteous influx of cash. They were completely intoxicated by their own fiction, feeling entirely untouchable and vastly superior. I looked down at my wrinkled hospital scrub pants and the oversized gray hoodie Harrison had handed me. I looked like a vagrant. I looked exactly like the broken, bankrupt failure my mother had always described to her country club circle when my name happened to come up. I closed the laptop with a sharp, deliberate snap, the sound ricocheting off the walls of the quiet room. Perfect. There is absolutely no better moment to dismantle a fraudulent facade than when the spotlight is shining at its absolute brightest. I grabbed the spare car keys Harrison had left on the nightstand. I was going to walk directly into their victory party, and I was going to do it right now, while they were at the peak of their delusion and completely drunk on stolen champagne. I parked Harrison's spare vehicle directly in the VIP valet zone of the Oakmont Country Club, ignoring the shouting attendants in their crisp white uniforms. I stepped out of the car, and the contrast was almost comical in its severity. Here I stood, in front of the most exclusive private establishment in the state, wearing wrinkled hospital scrub pants and a stained, oversized gray hoodie. The soles of my thin hospital socks were still caked with drywall dust from the gutted ruins of my stolen home. I looked like a ghost that had crawled out of a construction dumpster, but my posture was pure, unbroken steel. I pushed through the heavy mahogany entrance doors. The maitre d' stepped directly into my path, raising one hand with practiced authority, his eyes making a rapid, contemptuous sweep of my appearance. "Ma'am, you cannot be in here," he began. "There is a strict dress code in effect." I did not slow my stride by a single step. I walked straight past him, ignoring his frantic calls for security, and moved directly toward the main dining room. The ambient sound of a live string quartet mingled with the low, confident hum of wealthy people discussing stock portfolios and property values. I turned the corner, and there they were. My family had claimed the largest table in the center of the room as their personal stage. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow across an extravagant spread of seafood towers and vintage champagne. Cynthia was holding court at one end, laughing loudly at something a woman draped in diamonds had just said, her whole body radiating the performative ease of someone who believes she has permanently won. Andre occupied the head of the table beside my father, his custom linen suit immaculate, gesturing expansively with a lit cigar as he held the attention of the surrounding guests. Savannah was carefully positioning her brand-new Hermes bag for a photograph, tilting the logo precisely toward the camera lens with practiced, self-conscious deliberateness. They looked flawless. They looked completely untouchable. I walked directly to the edge of their table. The silence that rippled outward from my arrival was instantaneous and total. The wealthy guests at neighboring tables stopped mid-sentence. The string quartet faltered on a single note and did not recover. Cynthia looked up, and the champagne glass actually slipped from her fingers, striking the pristine white tablecloth and shattering. The dark liquid spread across the fabric like a wound opening. "Maddie," she gasped, her face draining to the color of ash, her eyes darting wildly across the room to register the stares of her precious country club friends. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be in a hospital bed." Andre dropped his cigar. The smug finance bro facade cracked for a fraction of a second before reassembling itself into something harder and more hostile. Savannah scrambled backward in her chair, clutching her orange designer box to her chest, as though I were carrying something contagious. But it was Richard who moved first. My father, always desperate to control the narrative and protect his carefully constructed social standing above all else, pushed back his chair and stood abruptly. The legs scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor. His face cycled rapidly through sheer panic before settling into a rigid mask of rage. He looked around at the murmuring crowd of investors and local elites, understanding in real time that the illusion of the successful, respected patriarch he had spent decades assembling was crumbling with every passing second. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket with a trembling hand and produced a sleek leather money clip. With aggressive, jerky movements, he peeled off a single crisp $500 bill. He did not hand it to me. He crumpled it slightly and threw it directly at my chest. The bill bounced off my hoodie and drifted to the floor, settling beside my dust-covered hospital socks. "Take that money and go find a motel room," Richard hissed, his voice low but carrying a vicious venom that the deadly silence of the dining room transmitted to every corner. "Do not embarrass this family any further. We have guests here. We have important business partners present. You have absolutely no right to walk into this establishment looking like a homeless vagrant and ruin what we have built." "You are a junk peddler," Richard continued, his tone soaked in contempt, doubling down with cruel precision as he felt the audience watching him. "You dig through dead people's belongings for a living. You have no husband, no children, no legacy of any kind. You have never understood how real wealth is created or maintained. Money in your hands simply rots. We redirected those assets to actual productive use. We secured a future for your sister and for this family. Now pick up that cash and get out of our sight before I have you removed for harassment." The sheer audacity of his words hung suspended in the air above the table. The surrounding diners literally inhaled in collective shock. A father, in front of the local elite, throwing money at his visibly unwell daughter and calling her a junk peddler in front of high society. Savannah recovered from her initial shock almost immediately, emboldened by our father's public cruelty. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut cleanly through the remaining tension. She crossed her arms, the new diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light with a calculated flash. "You heard him, Maddie," Savannah sneered, her voice dripping with entitlement so thick it had its own texture. "You are ruining my push-present celebration. You have always made everything about yourself." She turned her head and snapped her fingers at the two large security guards who had appeared at the entrance of the dining room. "Remove this woman immediately. She is trespassing and harassing paying members." The two men in dark suits stepped forward and reached for my arms. I did not fight them. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear, and I absolutely did not glance down at the $500 bill resting on the floor at my feet. I simply stood completely still. I locked eyes with Richard, then with Cynthia, then, finally, with Andre. I allowed the absolute zero temperature of my gaze to pass through their designer clothes and their stolen champagne and land somewhere far deeper. I gave them a look so stripped of warmth, so utterly devoid of any remaining human sentiment, that Richard actually took an involuntary step backward, his legs finding the chair behind him. I did not need to speak a single word. The silence was my weapon, and I wielded it with more precision than anything I could have said aloud. I turned on my heel. The dust from my hospital socks left a faint gray footprint on the polished floor beside the crumpled bill. I walked out of the dining room with my head perfectly level and my spine perfectly straight, and I did not look back once. They thought they had won. They thought they had humiliated me into submission and driven me back into whatever shadow I had crawled out of. They had absolutely no idea that I had simply been setting the stage. Let them enjoy their appetizers. The main course was coming, and it was going to choke them. The cool evening air was a sharp, clean contrast to the suffocating luxury of the dining room. I kept my pace measured and steady, my spine rigid, my chin level. The thin hospital socks registered every pebble and seam in the pristine country club asphalt, but I refused to acknowledge a single ounce of physical discomfort. Weakness was not something I could afford to display, not tonight, not anywhere near these people. I was nearly at Harrison's parked SUV when the heavy, pungent scent of a Cuban cigar rolled over me from somewhere to my left. "Hold up, Maddie." The voice was deep, deliberate, and soaked in arrogance. I stopped. I turned slowly. Andre stepped out from the shadow of a massive landscaped oak tree, taking a long, unhurried drag from his cigar and blowing the thick gray smoke with lazy precision into the space between us. He walked with that exaggerated, insufferable swagger, the practiced stride of a man who had spent years performing confidence for an audience and could no longer distinguish the performance from reality. He reached the SUV before I did and leaned his large frame against the driver's side door, deliberately blocking my entry. He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering on my oversized hoodie and hospital pants. A cruel, condescending smirk settled onto his face. "Do not take this personally, Maddie," Andre said, his tone carrying that particular brand of toxic, patronizing superiority that only truly insecure men achieve. "You are making this far too emotional. You need to detach your feelings from the situation and look at the actual larger picture. What happened here? It is just business." I looked at him without expression. The absolute audacity of this man was almost clinical in its scale. He had stolen my entire life while I was suffocating on my own kitchen floor, and he was standing in a custom linen suit under an oak tree in a country club parking lot, characterizing it as a business decision. "Your fundamental problem," Andre continued, lifting the cigar and gesturing with it as though he were delivering remarks at a financial summit, "is that you think small? You hoard your little pennies. You sit in that house surrounded by dusty antique furniture. You wipe down dead people's chairs and you call that a career. But capital in the hands of someone like you is stagnant. It is a dead asset. It accomplishes nothing and goes nowhere. I am a visionary, Maddie. I see liquidity where you see a living room. I see leverage where you see sentimentality." I remained completely silent. I gave him nothing. No reaction, no flinch, no invitation to stop. The silence only seemed to deepen his confidence. "I took the capital from that property," Andre continued, leaning slightly closer so I could register the expensive scotch on his breath. "And I deployed it into a 3 times leveraged long position. We are in an aggressive bull market cycle right now. Do you understand what that means? Probably not. It means I am generating returns while you stand in a parking lot in hospital clothes crying over a piece of real estate. I am the one carrying the future of this family on my back. The one building something real, something lasting, for Savannah and for our children. You were seed capital, Maddie. Honestly, you should feel honored that your boring little life finally served a meaningful purpose." I studied his face carefully. Behind the arrogant vocabulary and the expensive cigar, I could see it. The subtle, frantic twitch at the corner of his jaw. The faint sheen of cold sweat gathering at his hairline despite the cool evening air. He was projecting. He was performing certainty because the terrifying truth underneath all of it was that he was a degenerate gambler currently playing with stolen money, desperately hoping the market would not move against him before he could cover his tracks. He had reframed the financial destruction of his sister-in-law as a strategic market move. He genuinely believed that theft and fraud constituted alpha behavior. "Are you finished?" I asked. My voice was entirely flat. Andre frowned. He had clearly anticipated tears, or screaming, or some form of visible collapse he could dismiss and walk away from. Instead, he was standing in front of a wall of absolute zero. And it was beginning, just barely, to unsettle him. "Just accept the reality of your situation, Maddie," he sneered, pushing himself off the car door and stepping aside with theatrical magnanimity. "Find a reasonable apartment, go back to polishing your little teacups, leave the high-level financial maneuvering to the people who actually understand how the world operates." He spread his arms slightly, gesturing at the space around him as though it all belonged to him. I looked at him one final time. I did not raise my voice. I did not slap the smirk off his face. I did not produce legal documents or make threats or mention what was already in motion. I simply smiled. It was a thin, razor-sharp curve of the lips that carried absolutely no warmth and did not reach my eyes by even a fraction. "I hope your bull market lasts through the night, Andre," I said softly. His frown deepened. A flicker of something genuine, something that was not arrogance and was not swagger and was, unmistakably, the first real note of unease, moved briefly across his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but I had already turned my back on him, pulled open the heavy car door, settled into the passenger seat, and locked it shut in a single fluid motion. Through the tinted glass, I watched him stand motionless in the parking lot for a long moment, staring at the vehicle, cigar burning slowly between his fingers. He finally shook his head, took a dismissive pull of the cigar, and turned to walk back toward the club entrance. The swagger had returned, but it was slightly less convincing than before. I did not watch him go. I was already reaching into the leather bag on the floorboard and pulling out the laptop. I flipped the screen open, the bright white light cutting through the dark interior of the SUV. My fingers moved across the keyboard with punishing, focused speed. I connected to the secure mobile hotspot and opened my encrypted email client. I composed a new message. In the recipient field, I typed the direct contact address for the local FBI field office, specifically the White-Collar Crime and Financial Fraud Division. I did not write an emotional account. I wrote with the clean, precise language of someone who has spent a career presenting high-value asset documentation to people who do not have time for sentiment. I attached the high-definition security footage of Cynthia and Richard forcing my thumbprint onto the forged power of attorney documents while I convulsed on the kitchen floor. I attached the clear, time-stamped screenshots of the fraudulent notary. I attached the bank routing numbers and the wire transfer confirmation records. And finally, I attached a formal declaration identifying the $4 million Patek Philippe watch collection, currently sealed inside the property my parents had transferred across state lines under fraudulent terms. I reviewed every attachment a final time. The evidence was irrefutable, a perfectly assembled package of federal felonies, corporate fraud, title theft, interstate wire fraud, grand larceny on a scale that would make a federal prosecutor's career. And now, courtesy of Andre's arrogant little parking lot monologue, I knew precisely where the stolen capital was sitting. It was fully integrated into his highly leveraged cryptocurrency margin accounts, which meant the Securities and Exchange Commission would immediately flag him for large-scale money laundering the moment the FBI traced the wire. The trap was complete, and every exit had been sealed before any of them had realized the walls were closing. I stared at the screen for a single moment. They had wanted to play at high-level financial maneuvering. They had wanted to strip me to nothing and celebrate over my remains. They had made a catastrophic, irreversible miscalculation about the kind of person they were dealing with, and about what a woman leaves behind when she is left for dead and survives anyway. I moved the cursor over the send button. With one sharp, deliberate tap of my finger, I released it. The progress bar swept across the top of the screen and vanished. The dossier was gone, delivered cleanly and completely into the hands of the federal government. There was no undoing it. There were no takebacks, no negotiations, no quiet family settlements waiting on the other side. The systematic destruction of everyone who had signed their name to my death warrant had officially begun. I closed the laptop and set it carefully on the passenger seat. I leaned my head back against the cool leather headrest and closed my eyes, listening to the distant sounds of the country club, laughter, music, the faint clink of crystal, drifting across the parking lot from an entirely different world. Harrison returned to the SUV, tossed his keys into the center console, and took one look at my face. He put the car in gear without a word and drove us straight to his downtown law office. The city blurred past the tinted windows in streaks of amber and white. The federal machinery was now officially in motion, but the FBI moved at its own deliberate, methodical pace. I needed an immediate catalyst. I needed something to accelerate the timeline, to transform a white-collar paper trail into an active, physical crime scene before my family had time to move, regroup, or begin dismantling the evidence. I needed the final domino to fall. Miles away, in the quiet suburban darkness of my stolen neighborhood, it was already in motion. The arrogant house flipper had sent his construction crew home after my asbestos warning, but greed is a relentless and deeply irrational motivator. It does not respect sleep schedules. It gnaws at the rational mind and replaces it with something more animal and more desperate. He could not stop replaying the encounter in the gutted living room, the bizarre woman in hospital clothes, the untouched tile wall, the way I had screamed with genuine panic when his contractor aimed the drill at it. He had driven back to the property alone, his mirrored sunglasses replaced by a heavy flashlight. He stepped over the shattered remains of my custom kitchen island, the flashlight beam cutting cleanly through the settling layers of drywall dust. He walked straight to the back wall. He shined the beam directly onto the jagged crack I had deliberately created with the steel crowbar hours earlier. He leaned in close, pressing his thumb against the broken drywall edge, and through the narrow fissure, the light caught something. The unmistakable, dull gray gleam of a solid metallic surface lying perfectly flat beneath the decorative subway tiles. It was not a pipe. It was not a standard structural reinforcement beam. It was a massive, unbroken sheet of solid metal, seamlessly integrated into the very bones of the building. His heart began hammering with the intoxicating, irrational thrill of a man who has convinced himself he is about to discover a treasure. He told himself that my parents had sold him a property containing a forgotten hidden safe. He pictured stacks of abandoned cash, vintage jewelry, bearer bonds, whatever a bankrupt, eccentric woman might have concealed from her failing finances. The threat of asbestos evaporated from his mind entirely, dissolved by pure, overwhelming greed. He walked back to his heavy-duty work truck and retrieved a commercial-grade rotary hammer drill fitted with a diamond-tipped masonry bit engineered to chew through reinforced concrete. He carried it back into the dark kitchen, plugged it into a portable generator he had left on the floor, planted his boots firmly against the dusty floorboards, adjusted his grip, and aimed the spinning bit directly at the exposed metal edge visible through the crack. He squeezed the trigger. The drill roared to life, the sound violent and enormous inside the hollowed-out house. The masonry bit tore immediately through the ceramic tile surface and the thin-set mortar beneath it, sending a shower of white ceramic dust and fragments into the air. But the exact instant the diamond tip made contact with the hidden titanium alloy core of the vault, something unexpected happened. A shower of bright orange sparks erupted from the point of impact. The drill bit emitted a high-pitched, grinding metallic shriek as it spun against a surface it was entirely incapable of penetrating. The sheer force of the collision violently jerked the heavy tool backward, nearly wrenching the flipper's wrists from their sockets. He cursed loudly, stumbled back, and dropped the drill to the floor. He rubbed his aching forearms and stared at the shallow, embarrassing scratch mark left on the surface. He had barely registered as a nuisance. He had no idea what he had just triggered. Inside the house, nothing visibly changed. No alarm wailed. No strobes flashed in the windows. The quiet suburban street remained entirely undisturbed. The flipper assumed he had simply struck a heavy structural reinforcement plate, something that would require better equipment to penetrate, not a cause for concern. He wiped the sweat from his face, completely unaware that the property he was standing in had just become a digitally armed, federally monitored trap. The vault's security architecture had not been designed to frighten off opportunists with noise. It had been engineered to protect millions of dollars in classified, entrusted assets with quiet, irrefutable precision. The moment the internal vibration sensors detected the specific frequency signature of a high-impact industrial drill making contact with the titanium outer shell, the primary countermeasure engaged without hesitation. The Level 1 silent alarm protocol activated, and the internal computer, bypassing the local network entirely, transmitted a high-priority encrypted distress signal via a dedicated cellular uplink to two specific destinations simultaneously. The first was the emergency dispatch center of the local police department, flagging an active breach of a high-value commercial vault at a residential address. The second was my personal encrypted server. I was sitting in the corner of Harrison's downtown office, sunk deeply into the leather of a large guest chair, the clock on the wall reading just past 2 in the morning. Harrison was at his mahogany desk working through the civil injunction paperwork. The secondary strike, prepared and ready to deploy the moment the federal agents made their initial move. The office was quiet. The only sounds were the soft rustle of legal documents and the distant muffled hum of the city far below. Then the silence shattered. My laptop screen, resting on the glass coffee table in front of me, erupted. The standard desktop background vanished, replaced by a blinding, pulsing, blood-red display. A solid black warning box materialized in the center of the monitor, filled with scrolling GPS coordinates and a single blaring text notification. Unauthorized breach detected. Kitchen vault exterior. Level 1. Silent alarm engaged. Law enforcement dispatch initiated. The harsh red light flooded the dark office in a deep crimson wash. Harrison's pen stopped moving above his legal pad. He looked up at the flashing screen. His eyes widened as the full implication registered. The trap had been sprung. The greedy flipper had taken the bait and triggered an active crime scene directly on top of my parents' fraudulent property transfer. Local law enforcement was already mobilizing to respond to a high-value vault breach at a property that had been illegally transferred across state lines under forged documentation. The collision between local enforcement jurisdiction and active federal investigation was about to create an inescapable, multi-agency legal catastrophe for everyone whose name appeared on those forged documents. I closed the file folder I had been reading. I set it on the table with careful, deliberate precision. I stood up, smoothing the front of my borrowed gray hoodie with both palms. I looked at the flashing red screen for one long, measured moment, and then I looked directly at Harrison. "Let us go hunting," I said, my voice dropping to something quiet and absolute and entirely without mercy. "The game is over." The morning sun cut through the shattered living room windows in sharp, angled beams, illuminating a thick, slowly drifting cloud of pulverized drywall. The arrogant house flipper was covered from hairline to collar in white powder, sweat carving dark channels through the dust on his face as he swung a heavy sledgehammer in broad, desperate arcs against the exposed titanium edge of my vault. He had been at it for hours, driven far past rational judgment by the frantic, compulsive greed of a man who has convinced himself there is a fortune inches away from his reach. His breathing was ragged, his arms shaking with accumulated exhaustion, but he could not make himself stop. He raised the hammer for another strike, completely oblivious to the armada of vehicles currently surrounding the property in absolute silence. The screech of heavy tires across pavement was the only warning he received. 6 matte black SUVs locked down the perimeter, blocking every exit from the property simultaneously. Before the flipper could lower the hammer a final time, the front door came off its hinges with a single controlled impact. A dozen federal agents in full tactical gear flooded the foyer alongside officers from the local department, weapons raised, moving with the coordinated precision of people who had done this many times before. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, drop the hammer, hands behind your head, now." The sledgehammer slipped from the flipper's trembling hands and crashed to the floorboards. His knees hit the ground a moment later as two agents closed the distance and secured his wrists with heavy-duty restraints. Harrison and I stepped out of our vehicle, parked behind the perimeter of federal cruisers. The morning air was cool and extraordinarily clear. I adjusted the hood of my sweatshirt and walked up the driveway with the measured, deliberate stride of an executive arriving to inspect a completed acquisition. I stepped over the splintered remains of my own front door and walked directly into the kitchen. The flipper looked up from the floor. His mirrored sunglasses were knocked sideways across his face. His expression cycled through terror and bewilderment before landing on the face of a man who has just understood, in full, the scale of his mistake. He recognized me, and his eyes went wide. "What is happening?" he shouted, thrashing against the restraints. "You cannot do this. I own this property. I purchased it in a legitimate cash transaction from Richard and Cynthia. I have the deed. I paid $1.2 million in cold hard cash. This woman is trespassing. She has no right to be here." I did not look at him. I walked past his kneeling form and examined the shallow scratch marks the drill and sledgehammer had left on the exterior of my titanium vault door. He had barely troubled the surface. I turned around slowly and pulled a crisp, organized stack of legal documents from the leather folder Harrison placed in my hands. "You did not purchase a house," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the gutted room. "You purchased a stolen federal crime scene." Harrison stepped forward and dropped a thick binder of corporate filings directly onto a dust-covered sawhorse in front of the kneeling man. The impact made him flinch. "That transaction is entirely void," Harrison stated, his voice carrying the precise, lethal confidence of a man who has never once lost a case he believed in. "You did not purchase this property from Richard and Cynthia. You attempted to purchase an asset owned exclusively by Apex Estate LLC, a registered corporate entity that requires the direct authorized signature of its chief executive officer to execute any transfer of title. You bypassed standard escrow procedures in your rush to close quickly and accepted a forged medical power of attorney as the basis for that transaction. You wired $1.2 million to an unauthorized third party to obtain a stolen corporate asset. That wire constitutes federal wire fraud. And the asset you attempted to purchase contains a vault holding $4 million in entrusted billionaire assets, which means you are now a primary subject in an active interstate grand larceny and wire fraud investigation. The color left the flipper's face so completely and so quickly, it was almost medically interesting. Every trace of swagger and arrogance was gone, replaced by the sickening, dawning recognition of total financial annihilation. His entire operating capital, his entire budget for the year, had vanished into a fraudulent transaction that was now classified as the proceeds of a federal crime. And on top of that, he was sitting in restraints inside what was now an active federal crime scene, staring at a vault he had spent hours trying to open and had not even scratched. The panic in his eyes curdled almost immediately into raw, shaking, unhinged rage. "My money!" he roared, spittle flying from his lips as he thrashed against the restraints. "They stole my money. Those lying, fraudulent suburban snakes took every dollar of my liquid capital." He looked wildly at the lead federal agent, his voice cracking into something desperate and frantic. "I am a victim here. Let me call him. I want Richard on the phone right now. I want my money returned within the hour." The agent glanced at Harrison. Harrison gave a single, quiet nod. Establishing a live, documented line of communication between the defrauded buyer and the sellers on federal recording equipment would lock the wire fraud charges into place as irrevocably as a vault door. The agent pulled the flipper's phone from his jacket pocket, unlocked it using facial recognition, and dialed Richard's number on speakerphone. The call rang 3 times. Richard answered, his voice thick with sleep and the heavy residue of expensive champagne. "Hello?" Richard murmured. "Richard, you lying piece of garbage." The flipper's voice tore through the quiet kitchen like a blade. "The FBI is standing in this house right now. The transaction is void. You sold me a stolen corporate asset, you fraudulent thief." A sharp, audible gasp came through the speaker. Richard was suddenly, completely, and irreversibly awake. "What are you talking about? The transaction closed. We signed every paper." "You forged those papers!" The flipper screamed, the zip ties cutting into his wrists as he strained forward. "Listen to me very carefully, Richard. I am out $1.2 million in cash because of the criminal enterprise your family ran while your own daughter was dying in a hospital. I want that money wired back to my account within 60 minutes. If I do not see that wire clear, I am not going to wait for federal prosecution. I have associates in this city, people who resolve financial disputes in ways that do not involve courtrooms. I will send them to your country club. I will send them to your home. You will hand over what you stole, or I promise you there will be consequences that no lawyer and no judge can protect you from." The line went dead. Richard had disconnected in pure, cold terror. The extortion threat had been captured in its entirety on the body cameras of every federal agent in the room. The flipper was hyperventilating now, tears of rage and desperate, helpless fury streaking down his dust-covered face. I looked down at him with the calm, clinical detachment of someone assessing the final outcome of a very well-designed plan. The first domino had fallen completely. My father was now caught between a federal criminal indictment and a violent, extortion-driven debt collector. The money he had so proudly stripped from his dying daughter, the money he had thrown in my face and called wasted, was about to become the precise instrument of his ruin. I turned to Harrison and straightened the front of my gray hoodie with both hands. "The buyer has completed the fraud chain," I said quietly. "Let us go check on my sister and her financial genius husband. I understand the cryptocurrency markets are experiencing some volatility today." The interior of the Chanel boutique smelled of rich, deep leather and the kind of subtle, expensive perfume that is specifically designed to make certain women feel superior to other women. Cynthia stood at the VIP counter, entirely intoxicated by her own elevation, running her manicured fingertips slowly over the textured surface of a limited edition $15,000 handbag as though she were handling something sacred. She held her chin at a precise angle, the angle of a woman who requires every retail associate in the room to understand that she is not to be kept waiting. "Wrap it up," Cynthia said, dismissing the associate with a practiced wave of her hand. "And include the matching wallet. We are celebrating a fresh start today, and I intend to do it properly." She produced a heavy premium metal credit card from her designer purse and set it on the glass counter with a deliberate, resonant clatter, the sound of a woman announcing her arrival. The associate smiled with trained professional warmth and inserted the chip into the terminal. A sharp, single negative beep cut through the quiet boutique. "I am very sorry, ma'am," the associate said, dropping her voice to a discreet murmur. "The card has been declined." Cynthia's face flushed with instant burning indignation. She placed one hand flat against the counter with a sharp sound that drew the attention of several well-dressed shoppers nearby. "Your machine is malfunctioning," she announced. "Run it again. I have a 7-figure liquidity event clearing. That card carries an unlimited limit." The associate ran it again. The same clean, definitive beep. "Declined." Cynthia snatched the card back, her hands trembling visibly with the specific fury of someone who has never, in their adult life, been declined anything in public. She dug into her bag and produced 2 platinum cards from 2 separate banking institutions, setting them on the counter with barely controlled aggression. "Try both of these." The associate swiped the first. Declined. She swiped the second. Declined. The whispers began rippling through the boutique from every corner, quiet but unmistakable. the recognizable sound of high society observing someone's humiliation and recording it carefully for later. Cynthia pulled her phone from her bag with shaking hands, her face an escalating shade of furious crimson, and dialed the direct line to her private wealth manager. She expected the warmth of a familiar voice. She expected apologies, explanations, immediate corrective action, and possibly a follow-up call from a senior manager. The call connected, and she was transferred immediately, without ceremony, to the Fraud Prevention and Compliance Department. "Listen to me very carefully," Cynthia began, loudly enough for the entire boutique to hear. "I am attempting to make a purchase, and every one of my cards is refusing to process. I want this corrected immediately, or I will be moving my entire portfolio to a competing institution before close of business today." "Ma'am," the voice on the other end replied, unhurried, utterly detached, carrying the specific tone of someone reading from a document that cannot be argued with. "There has been no malfunction. Your accounts are no longer under our standard operational jurisdiction. As of 20 minutes ago, your entire financial portfolio, including all credit facilities, checking accounts, and investment instruments, has been frozen under a federal mandate." Cynthia's breath left her body in one sharp, involuntary sound. "What do you mean, frozen? I deposited $1.2 million in verified cash this week." "That specific deposit is the precise basis for the freeze," the compliance officer replied without inflection. "We have received a direct injunction from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are currently under active investigation for title fraud, grand larceny, and interstate wire fraud. The funds you deposited have been flagged as stolen corporate assets and are subject to immediate federal seizure. You have no access to any capital, not a dollar, until the federal inquiry reaches a formal resolution." The phone slipped from Cynthia's fingers and struck the marble floor of the boutique with a sharp, echoing crack. The $15,000 handbag was quietly and efficiently removed from the counter by the sales associate. Cynthia stood completely motionless, the terrifying reality of what was happening dismantling her constructed image of invulnerability in real time, in front of an audience of exactly the people whose respect she had spent her entire adult life pursuing. 12 miles away on the immaculate 18th green of the Oakmont Country Club, Richard was lining up a putt. He held a custom club, his posture casual and expansive, speaking loudly to 3 prominent local investors about his recent real estate maneuvers, positioning himself as a ruthless, clear-eyed dealmaker who had recognized a distressed asset and moved on it without sentiment. He was thoroughly enjoying the role. Before the putter could make contact with the ball, a golf cart accelerated across the manicured grass with unusual urgency and came to an abrupt stop nearby. The club manager climbed out, his face arranged into the expression of someone who has been given a deeply unpleasant task. "Sir," the manager said tightly, "you need to come to the front parking area immediately. There is a situation involving your vehicle." Richard handed his putter to his caddy with a put-upon sigh and turned to his companions with a self-deprecating smirk. "Probably a valet scratch. I will have them purchase me a replacement." He walked toward the front of the clubhouse with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never once been confronted with a consequence he could not redirect or absorb. The smirk died the instant he turned the corner. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck sat idling in the VIP parking zone, its engine loud and deliberate, while 2 workers in high-visibility vests secured thick steel chains around the axles of his pristine, brand-new Porsche Panamera. "Get your hands off my vehicle," Richard roared, breaking into a run across the pavement. "That car is paid for in full. I will bring your entire company to the ground in litigation." The tow truck operator did not flinch, did not pause, did not look up from his work until the chains were secured to his professional satisfaction. Then he turned, pulled a yellow and red official document from the clipboard on his door, and pressed it into Richard's chest. I do not work for a bank, the operator said, flatly and without any particular emotion. I was contracted by federal marshals. Richard's hands shook as he read the document. It was an asset seizure notice, bearing the official seals of the relevant federal agencies. The vehicle, it stated with the cold clarity of bureaucratic language, had been purchased using funds traced directly to an active federal wire fraud investigation. It was no longer classified as his property. It was classified as the proceeds of a crime. His wealthy golf partners had followed at a cautious distance and now stood watching in stunned, calculating silence as the tow truck engine engaged with a deep roar and hoist kingdom of 6 large monitors displaying real-time cryptocurrency charts and algorithmic trading dashboards. The stolen $1.2 million had been cleanly absorbed into his failing margin accounts, restoring his liquidity and keeping his heavily leveraged positions alive. He felt, in this particular moment, like an architect of the universe. He leaned forward to execute an adjustment on his primary trading terminal, and every monitor on his desk flickered simultaneously, the streams of green and red market data stuttering and dying, the screens going entirely dark for one suspended terrible second before a massive red error message hijacked every display in unison. Account suspended, SEC mandate, compliance lock. Andre dropped the cigar. He hammered his keyboard, clicked his mouse with frantic, repetitive urgency. Nothing responded. He grabbed his phone, and a high-priority automated notification chimed through his desktop speakers at that precise moment. He opened it. The message was a joint communication from his brokerage compliance department and the Securities and Exchange Commission. His hands went cold as he read it. The large capital injection into his trading accounts had been traced by federal authorities to an illicit wire fraud syndicate. His entire portfolio was frozen, effective immediately, pending formal investigation for felony money laundering. No, Andre whispered. No, no, no. He hit refresh on his secondary monitor. The lock screen blinked away for one brief, agonizing moment, just long enough to show him his live dashboard. The cryptocurrency markets were currently experiencing a sharp, significant downward correction. Under normal circumstances, with access to his capital, it would have been a manageable and temporary loss, the kind of dip a competent trader weathers without panic. But his accounts were locked by federal order. He could not inject additional funds. He could not liquidate smaller positions to cover the shortfall. He was completely, irrevocably locked out of his own portfolio at the precise moment the market turned against him. The broker's automated risk management system registered the frozen, deeply underwater account and responded exactly as it was designed to respond. Andre watched, in absolute and screaming silence, as the system executed a forced liquidation of every position he held, selling everything he owned at the worst possible prices, at the worst possible moment, with no human intervention permitted and no avenue of appeal available to him. Everything he had built, everything he had stolen, rebranded and presented to the world as genius, was being systematically erased, position by position, in real time, on screens he could see, but no longer control. The alpha mindset had met the federal government, and the federal government did not negotiate. Without the stolen capital to underwrite his catastrophically leveraged positions, the brokerage algorithm moved with merciless, automated efficiency, selling off every single asset he held at severe, compounding losses simply to cover the outstanding debt. Andre watched the numbers cascade downward in real time. 2 million, 1 million, 0. The numbers did not stop there. The forced liquidation closed out every position and kept going, leaving behind a massive, irrefutable negative balance. He was not simply wiped out. He personally owed the brokerage hundreds of thousands of dollars he did not possess and had no means of acquiring. He was officially, catastrophically, and permanently bankrupt. The SEC had obliterated his career, and the FBI was coming for what remained of his freedom. The mighty finance shark had drowned, alone and thrashing, in the stolen waters of his own tank. I sat in the quiet, deliberately calm safety of Harrison's downtown law office, sipping a glass of iced water with both hands wrapped around it. My laptop screen had become a mosaic of real-time digital destruction. I was actively monitoring the public blockchain ledgers, watching Andre's financial portfolio evaporate in slow, inevitable increments into a vast black hole of margin debt and federal seizure orders. It was, in its own clinical way, a beautiful symphony of algorithmic liquidation playing out precisely as I had designed it. Right on cue, my burner phone began vibrating violently across the glass coffee table, rattling insistently against the polished surface. The incoming caller was identified as a frantic, rapid succession of calls from my younger sister, Savannah. I let it ring 5 full times. Let her sweat. Let her sit inside the disintegrating wreckage of her stolen life and feel, even for just 30 seconds, a fraction of the helplessness I had experienced while suffocating on my own kitchen floor. On the 6th ring, I reached out slowly, picked up the device with deliberate calm, and tapped accept. I held it to my ear without uttering a single word. Maddie, please tell me you are there. Savannah's voice tore through the receiver, a jagged, hysterical wreck of a sound entirely unrecognizable from the carefully curated social media persona she had spent years cultivating. The background noise on her end was absolute, uncontrolled chaos. I could make out the distinct, sickening crash of heavy glass shattering and the muffled, terrified screaming of our mother somewhere nearby. I remained completely silent, allowing her desperation to bleed through the speaker and fill the quiet office around me like smoke. Maddie, you have to call them off. Savannah sobbed, her breathing ragged and fractured. You have to fix this right now. Andre is sitting on the floor of his home office holding his head and rocking back and forth. He is completely unresponsive. The federal agents took his laptops and confiscated both passports. And Mom and Dad, the man who bought your house, sent people. He sent actual thugs to the suburbs. They are outside right now throwing cinder blocks through the dining room windows. They smashed the Porsche before the tow truck even arrived to collect it. You have to call the police and tell them this was all just a misunderstanding. Please, Maddie. You are driving your own flesh and blood toward destruction. You are doing this to your own family. I took a slow, deliberate sip of iced water. The audacity was genuinely breathtaking. Even now, as her fraudulent world collapsed in real time into a pile of shattered glass, federal indictments, and violent debt collectors, Savannah was performing the role of the ultimate victim with practiced, instinctive precision. She was not calling to confess. She was not calling to accept responsibility for a single moment of what her family had done to me. She was calling to demand that I shield her from the consequences of her own felonies. How exactly am I driving you to destruction, Savannah? I asked, my voice as flat and cold as the surface of a frozen lake. I am sitting in a chair sipping water. You and your husband committed interstate wire fraud. Your mother and father committed grand larceny and attempted murder through deliberate medical neglect. You all constructed a house of cards on top of my grave, and now the wind is blowing. That is not my doing. That is the law. It was just a mistake, Savannah wailed, pivoting immediately to blame redirection with the seamless ease of someone who had been taught this particular manipulation tactic her entire life. We were desperate, Maddie. Andre needed liquidity to protect our future. You were in a coma. You were not even using the house. You have always been so bitter and jealous of what I have because you do not have a husband or children of your own. You are doing this on purpose. You are punishing me for being happy, and it is vindictive and cruel and completely unforgivable. We are your family. We share the same blood. You are supposed to be the bigger person here. You are supposed to forgive us and drop these charges before they destroy my IVF treatments. I deserve to be a mother, Maddie. I am supposed to be a mother. That was always my dream, and you are ripping it away from me. I closed my eyes for a moment, absorbing the complete, hermetically sealed toxic delusion contained in those words. She genuinely and sincerely believed that stealing my entire life savings, facilitating the fencing of billionaire entrusted assets, and cheerfully advocating for my death while I suffocated on my own floor was nothing more than a minor family misunderstanding. The kind of thing that should be quietly forgiven over the phone so she could proceed to purchase designer baby clothing on stolen credit. She viewed my continued existence as an inconvenience. She viewed my survival as an act of spite, directed specifically at her. "You want to talk about being a mother?" I said, my voice dropping to a register so quiet and so controlled that the silence of the office amplified it perfectly. "You want to invoke family and blood and forgiveness?" "Yes," Savannah cried immediately, grasping at what she mistook for a thread of empathy beginning to surface. "Please, Maddie, just call the FBI and tell them you authorized it. Tell them it was some kind of corporate loan arrangement. You can resolve this entire situation with a single phone call. Do not destroy my chance at having a child. Please." I did not answer her directly. Instead, I reached out to my laptop with one hand and navigated to an encrypted audio file I had extracted from the Hidden Vault's security interface during the same session in which I had downloaded the video of my parents forging my thumbprint. The high-definition microphones I had concealed inside the kitchen's air ventilation ducts had continued recording long after the fraudulent notary collected his briefcase and slipped out the back door. They had captured, in immaculate acoustic clarity, every single word my family had exchanged while standing over my paralyzed, convulsing body, waiting for the ink on the stolen documents to dry before anyone reached for a phone to call emergency services. "Listen very carefully, Savannah," I instructed, leaning slightly forward toward the laptop's speakers. "I want you to hear exactly what kind of family you actually are. In your own words." I pressed the space bar. The audio file played through the phone line with devastating fidelity. First came the sound that still reached somewhere primal and terrible inside me, my own ragged, deteriorating gasping as my airway swelled shut. Then the clean, precise click of high heels crossing hardwood toward the kitchen. And then, ringing out with absolute, immortalized clarity, came Savannah's voice. Sharp, impatient, and stripped of every trace of human compassion. "Just pull her plug and get it over with. She is practically dead anyway. The doctor said her brain is already starving for oxygen. We do not have time to sit here waiting for a probate court to release her funds on their schedule. Andre needs the cash by Friday, and I need to put down the deposit for my IVF clinic. Just sign the medical refusal and let her go so we can begin liquidating the estate." I paused the audio. The silence that fell across the phone line was total and absolute. The kind of silence that has physical weight. The sounds of breaking glass on Savannah's end had stopped completely. She had stopped breathing. The undeniable acoustic record of her own sociopathic greed had just been played back to her in crystal clear, ultra-high-definition audio, preserved with perfect fidelity by the very vault's security system she had never known existed. "The acoustic array behind the kitchen wall picks up every whisper within a 40-foot radius," I said into the silence, my voice carrying the surgical precision of a blade finding its mark. "The federal prosecutor already has the raw, unedited files. They know exactly what you said. They know you stood over my body and actively, enthusiastically advocated for my death so you could fund your fertility deposit." "Maddie," Savannah finally managed, her voice reduced to a microscopic, terrified squeak that bore no resemblance to the confident, sneering woman who had ordered security guards to remove me from a country club dining room. "Maddie, Please, that is not what I meant. I was panicked. I was not thinking clearly. I was not in my right mind. You were thinking with perfect clarity, I said, and something in my voice hardened into something beyond anger, something permanent and structural and utterly without warmth. You were thinking about Hermes bags and crypto margin accounts while your sister was choking to death on the floor 3 feet away from you. You wanted to play the ruthless financial predator alongside your husband. You wanted to be a shark. Well, congratulations, Savannah. You are in the water with the big fish now. I genuinely hope the federal prison system has adequate fertility resources, because that is the only medical program you will be accessing for the foreseeable future. I did not wait for her to scream. I did not wait for the next wave of begging or manipulation or theatrical emotional collapse. I pressed the red button on screen and cut the connection with a single, clean tap. I set the burner phone down on the table, looked at it for one moment, then dropped it directly into the trash can beside Harrison's desk. The golden child had finally met the executioner. I felt nothing that even resembled pity. The delusional resilience of the suburban elite is a genuinely fascinating psychological phenomenon. For my parents, reality had never been determined by facts, evidence, or the cold weight of federal indictments. Reality was manufactured and maintained entirely through appearances, through the performance of wealth, respectability, and social standing before an audience of equally image-obsessed peers. This was the operating principle of their entire lives, and a few felony charges were not, in their minds, sufficient reason to abandon it. Despite the fact that their bank accounts had been frozen by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Despite the fact that a violent debt collector had already hurled cinder blocks through their pristine dining room windows. Despite the fact that their son-in-law was sitting catatonic on the floor of a home office while federal agents photographed his belongings, Cynthia and Richard Anderson refused to cancel their annual Thanksgiving gala. In their deeply distorted worldview, canceling the party would constitute an explicit admission of defeat. It would send a visible, irrefutable signal to the country club elite, to the investors and socialites and wealthy neighbors who had constituted their entire social identity for 3 decades, that the rumors circulating about the family's financial collapse were not rumors at all. So Cynthia hired a private contractor with whatever loose cash she had managed to conceal from the federal sweep and had him board up the shattered dining room windows. She hung heavy silk curtains over the plywood panels with the same deliberate, theatrical attention to detail with which she approached every social performance of her life. And she proceeded to host 50 of the wealthiest individuals in the state as though nothing whatsoever was wrong, as though the world was exactly as immaculate and curated and controlled as it had always appeared to be from the outside. I knew exactly what they were doing, because Harrison had a private investigator positioned half a mile down their street, intercepting catering vans and logging the license plates of arriving guests in real time. They were running a survival fundraiser disguised as a holiday feast, and they had choreographed every element of it with desperate, fraudulent precision. Andre would be pacing the opulent living room at this very moment, rehearsing his pitch with the focus of a man whose freedom depended on every word landing correctly. I could picture him with complete clarity, straightening his designer tie in the hallway mirror, sweating faintly through his expensive cologne, preparing to corner his most financially significant investors beside the fireplace with a glass of premium bourbon and that rehearsed, magnetic smile. He would describe his firm as being in the middle of a monumental off-market corporate acquisition. He would explain that his capital was temporarily and bureaucratically tied up in a complex escrow arrangement, completely routine, completely temporary, completely resolved by the end of the month. He just needed a bridge loan. $500,000 in untraceable cash to secure a payout that would return 10 times the investment. Just a quick, quiet favor between trusted associates, and Cynthia would be coaching Savannah in parallel, instructing her on posture, on expression, on exactly which phrases would generate maximum sympathy from high-net-worth individuals who prided themselves on generous philanthropy. Wear something understated, elegant. Mention the IVF treatments with appropriate vulnerability. Let your hand rest gently over your stomach. They were going to weaponize the performance of impending motherhood to extract emergency funds from wealthy friends who had absolutely no idea they were being recruited as accessories to a federal money laundering scheme. The entire operation was a desperate venture capital pitch staged over roasted turkey and vintage champagne. They genuinely believed they could charm their way out of a Federal Bureau of Investigation indictment with the right guest list and a well-catered dinner. "They are actually going through with it," I said quietly, from Harrison's guest chair, the investigator's live updates feeding steadily into my earpiece. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. "They are carving the turkey while the federal government sharpens the guillotine." Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed, reviewing the tablet screen with the expression of a man who has seen every variety of human hubris, but never quite ceases to find it remarkable. "The guest list is an absolute who's who of regional wealth," he observed. "Andre invited every significant crypto backer he has cultivated over the past 3 years. Richard invited his entire inner circle from the country club. They are going to attempt a massive fundraising grift over the cranberry sauce." He set the tablet down. "We should notify the authorities to move in tonight before they actually secure any liquid capital from these investors." "No," I said, and stood up from the chair with a calm, deliberate finality that closed the discussion. "The authorities will have their designated turn. But if the FBI raids the house before Andre opens his mouth and runs his pitch, those investors will leave believing my family got caught up in a tragic bureaucratic misunderstanding. They will generate sympathy rather than disgust. I want those investors to hear Andre beg, in detail, on his feet, in his own words. I want them to understand in real time, with no possible ambiguity, that they are being pitched by a criminal who stole his own sister-in-law's assets and tried to leave her for dead. I am going to crash this dinner party myself. Right now." I crossed the office to the garment bag I had positioned earlier against the wall. I unzipped it and removed what I thought of, privately, as my absolute armor. A bespoke charcoal gray suit, cut with razor-sharp architectural precision and tailored to my exact measurements. The suit of a woman who has never once apologized for occupying space. I slipped into the crisp white silk shirt beneath it and fastened each button with calm, deliberate attention. I slid my feet into black stiletto heels that produced the sound of a gunshot on Harrison's hardwood floor with each step. I secured my hair into a severe, tight bun at the base of my skull, removing the last traces of softness from my silhouette. I examined my reflection in the dark glass of the office window. I did not look like a grieving daughter. I did not look like a woman recovering from 3 weeks in a medically induced coma. I looked like an apex predator arriving at the killing floor with full knowledge of exactly what she intended to do there. Harrison stood from his desk and adjusted his own tie. "I will drive," he offered, reaching for his keys. "We are not taking your car," I replied, checking the face of my wristwatch. "Right on cue." A heavy, authoritative knock resonated through the quiet law firm. Harrison's secretary opened the heavy double doors and immediately stepped aside, her eyes wide with involuntary shock. A man walked into the room and filled it instantly, not through volume or movement, but through the absolute, undeniable gravity of his presence. He was in his late 60s, wearing an immaculate navy blue suit that represented more capital than most people saw in an entire calendar year. His silver hair was combed back with the kind of precision that signals a man accustomed to every detail of his presentation being controlled. His piercing gray eyes carried the weight of decades of ruthless, consequential decision-making. The eyes of a man who had ended corporate careers the way other men ended chess games. He was not a lawyer. He was not a federal agent, he was the billionaire. The owner of the $4 million vintage Patek Philippe collection, currently sealed inside my hidden vault. The precise collection my family had attempted to steal and fence through the fraudulent property sale to an arrogant house flipper who had no idea what he was buying. Madison, the billionaire said, his voice a deep, graveled rumble that did not invite conversation so much as it demanded attention. I received your secure communication regarding the status of my assets. You informed me that a group of suburban opportunists attempted to illegally liquidate my property across state lines while you were incapacitated. That is correct, I said, maintaining complete composure and steady eye contact without effort. They forged my corporate signature to transfer the building containing your collection. They are currently hosting an elaborate Thanksgiving dinner funded with stolen assets, and they are actively attempting to raise bridge capital from wealthy investors to fund their legal defense or finance an exit from federal jurisdiction. The billionaire adjusted one solid gold cufflink with a small, precise movement. His jaw tightened with a restrained, terrifying fury. The controlled fury of a man who does not shout because he has never needed to. I have dismantled multinational corporations for attempting to manipulate my stock positions, he said evenly. I have zero patience for local cryptocurrency gamblers and country club housewives placing their hands on my private collection. He looked toward the door. I understand you are proceeding to this dinner to deliver a message. I am, I confirmed. I am coming with you, the billionaire said, with the absolute, unquestioned finality of a man who has not asked permission for anything in 40 years. I want to look these people directly in the eyes at the precise moment they understand whose property they attempted to steal. He turned toward the door and gestured with one heavy, decisive hand. My Maybach is idling downstairs with my security detail. I smiled. The trap was no longer merely set. It had just been loaded with a nuclear warhead. Let us go carve the turkey, I said. The matte black Maybach glided to a silent, perfectly controlled stop at the end of my parents' sprawling circular driveway. Through the tinted windows, I surveyed the grotesque spectacle of their desperation on full, unself-conscious display. Expensive luxury vehicles lined the street in both directions. Warm, golden light spilled from the front windows of the house, where heavy silk curtains had been hung with great care to conceal the sheets of plywood boarding up the shattered dining room glass. They were actively, enthusiastically celebrating their own impending catastrophe. The billionaire did not wait for his driver to open his door. He stepped out onto the pristine pavement, adjusted his suit jacket with one small, unhurried movement, and stood looking at the house with the cold, dispassionate assessment of someone who has purchased and disposed of assets far more significant than this. Harrison and I flanked him on either side. I drew one slow breath of crisp autumn air into my lungs and felt it fill me completely. I was no longer the woman who had lain suffocating and helpless on a kitchen floor while her family forged her signature. I was the architect of the destruction being assembled on the other side of those carefully hung silk curtains. We bypassed the valet stand entirely. I pushed open the heavy oak front doors of the house I had grown up in and stepped inside. The full volume of the party met us immediately. The low, confident murmur of wealthy people performing prosperity. The delicate clink of crystal. The trained movements of catering staff in pressed white shirts circulating with champagne flutes and caviar. A string quartet played something tasteful and carefully chosen in the far corner of the grand foyer. The air was thick with the mingled scents of roasted turkey, truffle oil, and expensive imported candles, all of it conspiring to mask the underlying odor of financial rot and federal desperation. In the center of the sunken living room, framed by the massive stone fireplace, Andre was holding court. He stood in his custom linen suit, an unlit cigar in one hand and a glass of premium bourbon in the other, surrounded by 5 of the most financially influential venture capitalists in the region. His voice carried across the room with the booming, practiced confidence of a man who has told the same story so many times he has begun to believe it himself. It is all about leveraging temporary liquidity for permanent compounding gains, Andre announced, his chest expanded, his posture radiating the manufactured authority of someone performing expertise rather than possessing it. My firm is currently restructuring a monumental off-market acquisition. The capital is secured in a bureaucratic escrow arrangement, completely standard, completely temporary, but the payout is going to be astronomical. I am offering you gentlemen the exclusive ground floor opportunity to bridge this minor gap and double your returns by Monday morning. This is the kind of deal that does not get offered twice. I descended the 3 steps into the sunken living room. My black stiletto heels struck the hardwood floor in the silence between his sentences with the sharp, ringing authority of a judge's gavel. I highly doubt you will be executing any trades by Monday morning, Andre, I announced, my voice cutting cleanly through the polished hum of the room like a blade through still water. Unless the federal detention facility has installed trading terminals in the holding cells since my last update. The string quartet stopped playing mid-phrase. The ambient conversation across the entire room evaporated in a single second. 50 pairs of carefully maintained, socially calibrated, wealthy eyes turned to look at me, standing at the base of the living room steps in a charcoal blazer and black stilettos, radiating a calm so absolute it was its own kind of violence. Andre froze. The bourbon glass in his hand tilted slightly, releasing a few amber drops that vanished into the expensive Persian rug. The arrogant smile, that manufactured, practiced expression he deployed like a professional tool, dissolved from his face, replaced by a sickening pallor that crept up from his collar and spread across his features. Savannah, who had been positioned nearby displaying her Hermes bag to an admiring cluster of socialites, released her champagne flute. It fell and shattered against the floorboards, a sound that echoed through the paralyzed room with a resonance that felt, in the moment, almost deliberately theatrical. Cynthia pushed through the frozen crowd, her face cycling rapidly through sheer panic before assembling itself into furious, imperious indignation. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, a last desperate attempt to project absolute social control, and she pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at me. "Security!" Cynthia shrieked, her voice pitching upward with an unhinged edge that no amount of rehearsal could smooth. "Someone get the valet. Get someone in here to remove this woman immediately. She is a degenerate. We disowned her years ago. She is mentally unstable and has been making delusional accusations against this family because she is consumed by jealousy." She pivoted to the stunned investors with a rigid, plastic-edged smile that looked like a mask cracking at its seams. "Please forgive this hideous interruption, gentlemen. My estranged daughter suffers from severe psychological dysfunction. She is broke, she is bitter, and she is experiencing some kind of episode because she cannot tolerate her sister's husband's success. This does not reflect anything about the investment opportunity on the table." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at her at all. I simply stepped to my left, creating a clean line of sight from the foyer into the sunken living room, and stepped aside. The billionaire moved forward out of the shadows of the entrance hall. The temperature in the room dropped. It was not a metaphor. The sheer gravitational weight of his presence, the way every person in the room who operated at any significant level of financial power recognized him in the same instant and recalibrated everything around that recognition, produced a physical, collective response. The venture capitalists surrounding Andre did not simply notice him. They reacted to him. They straightened. They went quiet. They understood immediately and instinctively that they were in the presence of a man who could restructure their entire professional lives with a single phone call, and they behaved accordingly. "You are calling my senior estate liquidator a degenerate," the billionaire said. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. It carried the low, resonant authority of a man who has spoken in rooms where empires were decided, and every person present understood this on a biological level. Cynthia's mouth opened and produced no sound. Her eyes fixed on his face, and the color drained from hers completely. "You stand in this house, pouring champagne purchased with stolen funds, begging these men for emergency bridge loans to finance your legal defense. You perform the role of a family of substance and integrity." He took one slow, deliberate step toward her. "My security team has confirmed that you and your husband forged legal documents to illegally transfer ownership of a building belonging to this woman, a building that currently contains $4 million of my personal vintage assets, sealed inside a biometric vault that you did not know existed and could not open." The silence that followed was so complete and so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. "You attempted to steal and fence my private property to cover the catastrophic cryptocurrency gambling debts of your son-in-law," the billionaire continued, turning his steely gray gaze to Andre with the slow precision of a targeting system locking on. "And you have the extraordinary audacity to stand in front of my business associates tonight and solicit their capital to fund your escape from federal jurisdiction." The venture capitalists surrounding Andre physically recoiled. They took visible, instinctive steps backward, as though proximity to him had suddenly become measurably dangerous. The word stolen resonated through their minds with the specific visceral alarm that only people who manage serious capital truly understand. $4 million. A billionaire's assets. Stolen. The implications assembled themselves instantly and completely. Andre was not offering them an investment opportunity. He was attempting to recruit them as accessories to a federal money laundering syndicate. The senior investor, a silver-haired man whose firm managed more capital than the combined net worth of everyone else in the room, set his bourbon glass down on the fireplace mantel with a single sharp, deliberate click. He looked at Andre with an expression of pure, undisguised revulsion. "You attempted to use our capital to cover a federal grand larceny charge," the investor said, his voice carrying the soft, absolute weight of a man who does not need volume to convey finality. "You are not a visionary, Andre. You are not a strategist. You are a desperate, fraudulent thief who stole from a man whose portfolio dwarfs your entire existence. Do not ever contact my firm, my associates, or any member of my network again." He turned from the fireplace and walked toward the door with the measured stride of someone who has already erased an entire episode from his professional memory. The 4 remaining venture capitalists followed immediately and without hesitation. They did not simply leave. They evacuated, pulling on coats, abandoning half-full glasses, moving toward the door with the unanimous, unspoken urgency of people who want zero forensic proximity to a federal crime scene. Within 90 seconds of the billionaire's final word, the investment audience Andre had spent weeks assembling had removed itself completely from his orbit. Andre stood alone beside the fireplace, his arms hanging at his sides, his cigar cold between his fingers. Every scaffolding of his carefully constructed facade, the alpha mindset, the financial genius narrative, the generational wealth mythology, had been stripped away in less than 3 minutes, leaving nothing underneath but a terrified, hollowed-out man staring at the absolute ruins of everything he had ever claimed to be. He had played his final card on the most important night of his financial life. I had set the entire deck on fire before he could lay it down. The billionaire's declaration hung in the air of the living room like heavy, toxic smoke that no amount of expensive candles could neutralize. Cynthia began to shriek, a high-pitched, grinding, escalating sound of pure denial. She waved her arms in broad, frantic arcs, screaming at the remaining guests that everything they had witnessed was a fabrication, that I was a malicious hacker attempting to frame her blameless family, that the video evidence and the billionaire standing in her living room were somehow elements of an elaborate conspiracy against her. Richard joined in immediately, his face purple, bellowing for the valet to summon police to arrest me for trespassing on private property. I ignored them both completely. I walked past my screaming mother and my hyperventilating sister with the focused, unhurried purpose of someone who has a specific task to complete. I moved directly toward the massive 85-inch flat-screen television mounted above the grand stone fireplace. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal blazer and produced a sleek, silver USB drive. The room watched in absolute paralyzed fascination as I inserted the drive cleanly into the television's side port and executed a synchronized command from my smartphone. The screen flickered to life. I did not need to raise my voice over my parents. I had the surround sound system to do the communicating for me. The ultra-high-definition security footage from my hidden kitchen cameras filled the massive screen. The room drew a collective breath. They watched me collapse onto the hardwood floor, clutching my own throat, my face turning a devastating shade of purple as the anaphylactic reaction took full, brutal hold of my body. They saw the authentic, unperformable physical agony of a person's airway closing while she was fully conscious and aware of what was happening. Then the audio engaged, crystal clear, perfectly preserved, entirely incontrovertible. The room heard the precise, unhurried click of Cynthia's high heels crossing the kitchen floor. They watched my mother and father stand over the convulsing body of their eldest daughter with the calm, businesslike composure of people executing a planned task. They watched the fraudulent notary enter the frame with his briefcase. Several women in the audience pressed their hands to their mouths. A man near the back of the room looked away. The video showed Richard kneeling beside me, lifting my limp arm, pressing my unresponsive thumb against an ink pad, and then forcing my biometric signature, methodically, document by document, onto the forged power of attorney and the fraudulent property deed transfer. Richard lunged forward, his face drained of all remaining blood. "Turn that off," he roared, his voice cracking with the specific terror of a man watching himself be destroyed by his own recorded actions. He scrambled toward the fireplace, reaching past guests and decorations to get to the thick power cord concealed behind the television's mounting bracket. He never made contact with it. Harrison stepped smoothly into his path with the unhurried precision of a man who anticipated the move before it was made. Harrison did not raise his hands. He did not speak loudly. He planted his broad shoulders, squared his stance, and regarded Richard with the cold, entirely composed expression of someone who has absolute procedural authority and is not remotely interested in being challenged. "Touch that cord, Richard," Harrison said quietly, "and I will personally ensure that tampering with federal evidence and obstruction of justice are added to your existing indictment before midnight. Step back right now, or I will ask the billionaire's security team to physically remove you from this section of the room." Richard's hands hovered in the air for one suspended moment. Then he backed away from the fireplace entirely, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking several sizes too large on him, as though the person who had been filling it had already begun to disappear. I tapped my phone screen a second time. The security footage minimized and was replaced by a sprawling, complex financial diagram, a digital map of the entire criminal architecture my family had constructed, rendered in stark, unambiguous visual language for an audience of people who understood financial documentation instantly and completely. The screen displayed bank statements, appropriately redacted for legal purposes but unmistakably legible in their essential structure. A bright red digital arrow traced the precise path of the $1.2 million from the fraudulent property sale. The diagram showed the capital flowing from the House Flippers account into a shell account controlled by Cynthia and Richard. From there, a second thick red line traced the wire transfer of the entire sum to its final destination, which flashed on the screen in large, deliberate, impossible to misread text. Andre's highly leveraged personal cryptocurrency margin account. I turned my back to the television and faced the remaining investors who had gathered near the foyer in various states of stunned immobility, processing what they were seeing with the systematic, analytical attention that serious financial professionals cannot turn off even in moments of personal shock. "You believed you were listening to a financial prodigy this evening," I said, my voice projecting through the room with total, effortless clarity. "You thought you were being offered an early position in a brilliant market strategist's newest acquisition. You were not." I pointed a single direct finger at Andre, who was in the process of lowering himself onto the edge of the designer sofa with the slow, disconnected movement of a man whose motor functions are operating on a delay. "You are standing in front of a degenerate gambler whose cryptocurrency positions were obliterated by a routine market correction. He could not survive because he had no legitimate capital to absorb the loss. He did not generate alpha. He did not structure a bridge loan. He took money acquired through the attempted murder of his sister-in-law, money transferred via forged deeds and fraudulent wire instructions, and he pumped every dollar of it directly into unregulated leveraged crypto positions to keep his brokerage accounts alive for one additional week while he figured out his next move. If any one of you transfers a single dollar of your firm's capital to this man or any entity associated with him tonight, the Securities and Exchange Commission will classify you as accessories to felony money laundering and freeze your portfolios before you reach your vehicle." The response was instantaneous and carried the specific, merciless efficiency of people who manage serious risk for a living. The senior silver-haired investor had his chief operating officer on the phone before I finished speaking. "Terminate the Andre account," he said, loudly enough for the entire room to hear, his eyes fixed on my brother-in-law with an expression of cold, professional disgust that Andre would remember for the rest of his life. "Cancel every pending contract, flag the individual and his affiliated entities to our entire compliance board. Effective this moment, we have zero association with this man or anyone connected to him." He ended the call, looked at Andre for one final dismissive second, and walked toward the door. The other 4 investors executed identical actions with minor variations in phrasing. Voices overlapped across the foyer. Urgent, clipped, precise, giving rapid-fire instructions to sever, liquidate, flag, and terminate. They were actively, systematically quarantining themselves from the toxic exposure Andre represented, with the focused efficiency of professionals who have been trained to move first and ask questions later when a federal compliance risk becomes visible. Andre's knees gave out. He collapsed fully onto the sofa, buried his face in both hands, and began breathing in the shallow, ragged rhythm of a man experiencing the complete systemic failure of everything he had constructed his identity around. His entire professional existence, the firm, the investor relationships, the brand, the narrative, was being dismantled by telephone in his parents-in-law's living room while he sat and listened to it happen. He was not just broke. He was not just under federal indictment. He had been publicly, permanently, and irreversibly blacklisted from every significant financial institution in the region before a single federal agent had walked through the door. The door came off its frame less than 4 minutes later. The silk curtains Cynthia had hung so carefully over the plywood-covered windows strobed red and blue as the tactical emergency lights from the surrounding vehicles painted the entire front facade of the house. The heavy oak front doors did not open. They were breached. A single controlled impact that sent them back against the interior walls with a sound like a gunshot fired inside a cathedral. 12 federal agents in full tactical gear flooded the foyer, their movements coordinated with the seamless efficiency of a unit that had executed this precise operation many times before. Local police flanked them on both sides, establishing a physical perimeter from every exit: the dining room, the terrace door, the side corridor, simultaneously. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent's voice cut through the chaos of gasping guests and shattering crystal like an announcement over a public address system. Nobody moves. Hands visible. Now. The lead agent, tall, broad-shouldered, with the severe expression of someone whose professional patience for human weakness and entitlement is fully exhausted, walked directly past the trembling catering staff and stepped down into the sunken living room. He did not look at the holiday decorations. He did not look at the food. He did not look at the guests. He looked directly at the three people standing at the center of the financial slaughterhouse I had spent the past month constructing with deliberate, meticulous care. Richard and Cynthia Anderson. The lead agent's voice was entirely devoid of ceremony or sympathy. You are both under arrest for multiple federal counts of interstate wire fraud, title fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Put your hands behind your backs immediately. The illusion of their untouchable suburban royalty shattered like the champagne glass Cynthia had dropped at the country club, completely, into too many pieces to count or reassemble. Richard's face went slack. The confident, contemptuous patriarch who had thrown cash at my chest in a country club dining room 24 hours earlier was trembling with both hands raised above his head. A federal agent spun him around and secured his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic click of the locking mechanism rang out through the living room with a clarity that felt, in the moment, like punctuation. Cynthia did not surrender quietly. The instant the arresting agent reached for her arms, the polished, performative country club matriarch she had spent her entire adult life constructing simply collapsed, replaced by a raw, thrashing, shrieking woman fighting against restraints with the specific animal desperation of someone who has genuinely never believed this moment could arrive. She dropped to her knees, her elegant emerald green gown pooling around her on the hardwood floor like the remnants of a costume. She screamed, a sustained primal sound of denial that bore no relationship to the composed, gracious hostess voice she had deployed just 40 minutes earlier. She kicked and twisted and called for help from an audience that stood watching in absolute silence. "You cannot do this to me," Cynthia screamed, fighting the agent's hands with every ounce of her remaining energy. "I am a respectable woman. I am a member of this community. This is a misunderstanding. My daughter is a liar and a thief, and she has done this to our family out of spite. You are ruining my dress. You are ruining my dinner. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea who I know?" The agents hauled her to her feet and secured the cuffs without responding. Her flawless blowout was destroyed. Her composure was gone. The mask she had worn for 30 years had been removed by someone else's hands in front of every person she had ever tried to impress. A separate team of agents moved to the sofa where Andre remained seated in a near catatonic state, staring at the Persian rug as though it might offer him an exit from the dimension he currently occupied. The forced liquidation of his entire portfolio, the public destruction of his investor relationships. The billionaire's words hanging in the air of the living room, the federal agents in the foyer. He did not fight. He did not argue. He did not try to run. "Stand up, Andre." The arresting agent placed one firm hand on his shoulder and lifted him to his feet with a single motion. "You are under federal arrest for felony money laundering and the execution of fraudulent interstate wire transfers. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly recommend you exercise it immediately." Andre stared at the floor as the cuffs were secured around his wrists. The man who had delivered lectures about alpha mindsets and generational wealth, and diamond hands in parking lots and living rooms and country club dining rooms was led out of the house in the exact same direction his parents-in-law had just gone. His custom linen suit wrinkled, his cigar abandoned on the mantel, his professional identity reduced to a series of federal charge numbers. The room dissolved into frantic, buzzing, desperate motion as the remaining guests surged toward the exits, presenting identification to police officers and answering brief, pointed questions while trying simultaneously to project the absolute maximum possible distance between themselves and everything that had just unfolded. In the center of all of it, the chaos, the flashing lights, the agents, the guests, the ruins of a holiday dinner that would never be eaten, Savannah stood completely alone. The golden child. The sister who had stood over my convulsing body and told our mother to pull my life support so she could fund her fertility treatments. The woman who had ordered security guards to remove me from a dining room. The woman who had sneered and snapped her fingers and clutched her designer bag and called me a burden and a failure and a cautionary tale. She stood in the wreckage of her entire constructed world and watched her husband being led out the front door in chains, watched her mother being hauled to her feet by federal agents, watched her father staring at the floor of a police vehicle. The reality of her total destruction did not arrive gradually. It arrived all at once, like a structure failing. The way buildings don't slowly fade, they stand, and then they don't. Savannah let out a ragged, broken sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a scream. Her knees buckled. She stumbled forward across the living room, moving through the crowd of departing guests, her eyes fixed on me with an expression of desperate, unmediated terror. She crossed the distance between us and her legs gave out entirely. She collapsed at my feet, not metaphorically, not dramatically for an audience, but with the complete physical helplessness of someone whose body has simply run out of the scaffolding that was holding it upright. She threw her arms forward and wrapped both hands around my stiletto heels, pressing her forehead against the hardwood floor. "Maddie." Her voice was a wet, wrecked whisper. "Sister, please, please, I am begging you. Tell them to stop. Drop the charges. I have nothing left. I have no husband, I have no parents, I have no money. I do not know how to live without them. I never learned. Please, Maddie. You have to help me. We share the same blood. You cannot let this happen to your own family." I looked down at her. I felt nothing that resembled pity or grief or the residual pull of childhood attachment. What I felt was the absolute, clean, cold completion of a transaction that had been in motion since the moment I opened my eyes in that hospital room and found my accounts at zero. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal blazer. My fingers found a single crisp piece of paper I had been carrying specifically for this moment, since the second I bent down and picked it up from the country club dining room floor the previous evening. I pulled it out slowly. It was the $500 bill Richard had crumpled and thrown at my chest. The bill that was supposed to represent my entire diminished value as a human being, my consolation prize for being the wrong daughter. I held it between my fingers for one moment, then folded it deliberately into a tight, compact ball. I let it drop. It fell through the air and landed on the hardwood floor directly in front of Savannah's tear-streaked, mascara-ruined face. "Take that and arrange transportation," I said, my voice quiet and entirely without cruelty. Just factual, just final. This house no longer belongs to anyone in your family. It is being seized and foreclosed to offset a fraction of the financial damage your husband caused. Go upstairs and take whatever clothing fits in a single bag. Do it quickly, before the police seal the doors and you find yourself in the cold with nothing at all. I did not wait to watch her reach for the bill. I turned away from her, from the sound of her crying, from the ruins of the dinner, from the silk curtains and the plywood and the smell of roasted turkey going cold, and I walked toward the front door with the measured, unhurried stride of someone who has completed every item on a very long list. The billionaire and Harrison walked beside me. We stepped through the splintered doorframe and out into the crisp autumn night together, leaving behind the burning wreckage of what had once been called my family, without looking back once. 1 month later, the heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse closed behind the last member of the gallery with a resonant, definitive thud that seemed to seal the room's purpose around itself. The air inside was the specific air of institutional justice, cool, sterile, carrying the weight of decisions that cannot be walked back. I sat in the second row of the gallery in a precisely tailored white suit, my spine perfectly straight, my hands folded in my lap, my expression carved from something that had moved well past anger into the clean, permanent territory of resolution. I did not cry. I did not feel pity. I watched the federal government's machinery complete the work I had set in motion with a composed attention that would have been mistaken, by anyone who did not know the full story, for indifference. At the defense table, Andre was unrecognizable. The man who had delivered monologues about alpha mindsets and generational wealth, who had blown cigar smoke into parking lots and bragged about diamond hands, sat in a county-issued tan jumpsuit that bore no relationship to the custom linen suits he had treated as a second identity. He sat slumped in his wooden chair, studying the polished floor with the blank, empty focus of someone who has already processed his own destruction and moved to the far side of it. His assets had been seized and liquidated by the Securities and Exchange Commission with a thoroughness that left him unable to retain private legal counsel of any description. He sat beside an overworked public defender who was managing an overwhelming caseload and had time to offer him a legal pad and a set of realistic expectations, nothing more. When the federal prosecutor outlined the layered complexity of Andre's money laundering operations, the precise mechanics of how he had absorbed stolen funds into leveraged cryptocurrency positions to evade immediate detection, and the catastrophic losses those positions had inflicted when the market moved against him and the SEC froze his accounts simultaneously, Andre did not flinch, did not blink, did not look up from the floor. He accepted the account of his own destruction with the hollow, empty stillness of a man who has no version of events left to argue. My parents occupied a different register entirely. Cornered rats fight with what they have, and what Cynthia and Richard had was each other, which meant they had a target. Cynthia stood before the federal judge with tears that were genuine enough in their production, but utterly transparent in their strategic deployment. She described herself as a confused, emotionally overwhelmed mother who had been financially coerced and manipulated by her husband, a man she now characterized as domineering, controlling, and the sole architect of every decision that had led them to this courtroom. She claimed she had not understood the full legal implications of the documents she signed. She claimed she had been trying to protect her younger daughter from financial devastation. She claimed the fake notary had been entirely Richard's arrangement, that she had merely been present, that she had raised concerns she could not prove in writing, but which she described with considerable emotional conviction. She pointed at Richard repeatedly, emphatically, and with a trembling finger that she had deployed in enough country club settings to know was effective. Richard fired back with the purple-faced, indignant fury of a man who has spent his entire life redirecting blame and genuinely does not understand why it is not working now. He exposed Cynthia's credit card debt, amounts that made the gallery murmur, and described in detailed, bitter terms her decade-long obsession with funding Savannah's lifestyle to maintain a specific social image. He characterized himself as a man driven by the relentless financial pressure of a wife whose spending had long since outpaced their legitimate income, a man who had made desperate choices under impossible circumstances. He used the word coerced 11 times. He wept once, briefly, in a manner that convinced no one in the room. They threw each other under the bus with the same efficient, unsentimental ruthlessness they had applied to forging my signature on a property deed while I suffocated beside them. They aired 30 years of family secrets, debts, affairs, resentments, failures, in a packed federal courtroom, in front of a gallery full of strangers, because each of them calculated that destroying the other's credibility was worth more than any remaining loyalty between them. They proved, in their final public performance together, that they had never possessed loyalty to anyone but themselves. Not to each other, not to their children, not to any version of family that bore any resemblance to the word. The federal judge, a compact, silver-haired woman whose 20 years on the federal bench had produced in her a comprehensive and permanent immunity to theatrical displays of suburban entitlement, listened to their exchange with the expression of someone watching a type of behavior she has cataloged thoroughly but has not become accustomed to. She allowed them to finish. Then she brought her gavel down with a sharp, decisive crack that instantly reduced the courtroom to total silence. I have presided over complex financial fraud cases for 2 decades, the judge said, her voice filling the room without effort or elevation. I have seen corporate embezzlement of extraordinary sophistication. I have seen elaborate, multi-generational Ponzi schemes constructed by genuinely intelligent criminal minds. I have seen financial crimes designed with a cold, calculating precision that commands a certain grim professional respect. She looked at my parents without any trace of professional deference. What I am looking at today defies the framework I normally apply to financial crime. You did not simply forge a power of attorney to execute an illegal real estate transfer. You stood over your eldest daughter, a woman in the middle of a life-threatening anaphylactic episode, and you made a deliberate, conscious, collaborative decision not to call for emergency medical assistance until you had secured her biometric signature on the fraudulent documents you needed to liquidate her assets. You were prepared to allow her to die. You were, in the most direct sense available to this court, willing to end your own child's life in order to expedite a theft. That is not wire fraud. That is not title fraud. That is predatory, calculated malice of an order that I have encountered rarely in 20 years on this bench. The courtroom held its breath. The gavel came down again. Richard Anderson. 5 years in federal prison. No possibility of early parole. Cynthia Anderson. 5 years in federal prison. No possibility of early parole. Andre. 8 years for interstate money laundering, execution of fraudulent wire transfers, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. Furthermore, total seizure of all remaining assets held in any account, under any name, traceable to any of the 3 defendants. Every remaining luxury vehicle, every remaining piece of jewelry, every investment account, every property held under any related entity, all of it forfeited to the federal government to offset penalties, repay defrauded parties, and satisfy the civil judgments filed against them. They were led out through the center aisle of the gallery toward the holding area. The heavy-set bailiff moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has escorted many people in this direction. As they passed the second row of the gallery, as they passed me, Cynthia turned her head. She looked at me with the specific expression of a person who has finally, fully comprehended the permanence of a consequence she spent her entire life believing she could charm or manipulate her way out of. The emerald gown was gone. The salon blowout was gone. The country club poise was gone. What remained was a woman who was about to trade everything she had constructed her identity around for a concrete cell and a prison uniform, and who understood, in this moment, that no amount of sobbing or appealing or invoking maternal bonds was going to change that arithmetic. Maddie. Her voice broke against the marble walls of the corridor and echoed back. Maddie, please. I am your mother. Tell the judge you forgive us. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please, Maddie, I am begging you. Don't let them take me away. You are my daughter." I stood up from the wooden bench. I smoothed the front of my white suit jacket with both hands. I looked at her, directly, clearly, without hesitation, without flinching, without any of the residual emotional complexity that the word mother had carried for me my entire life, until the moment I watched the security footage from my kitchen and understood, completely and irrevocably, what she was. I turned away from her. I walked toward the back of the courtroom and through the heavy doors and out into the white light of the exterior without pausing, without looking back, without offering a single word in response to her voice echoing after me through the corridor. The federal prison system had them now. I had an empire to build. The federal prison system absorbed my parents and my brother-in-law with the complete institutional indifference it applies to everyone who passes through its doors, regardless of how many country club memberships or tailored suits they once possessed. But the universe, it turned out, had reserved a specifically calibrated punishment for the golden child, one that did not involve a cell or a sentence, but which struck me, on reflection, as considerably more precise. Savannah did not receive a criminal indictment. Her signature was not on the forged power of attorney. The federal prosecutors reviewed her involvement, assessed the available evidence, and made the decision not to pursue charges against her. She walked out of the federal building a free woman. But freedom is a relative concept when the government methodically seizes everything you own. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the bankruptcy courts worked through her life with the same thorough, unhurried efficiency they apply to all assets implicated in federal financial crimes. The suburban mansion, seized. The luxury vehicles, confiscated. The designer wardrobe, cataloged, assessed, and sold at federal auction. The Hermes bags that had been photographed and live-streamed and celebrated with champagne now tagged with lot numbers and sold to strangers to partially offset the debt Andre had generated and distributed. The diamond bracelets, the jewelry, the everything. All of it gone, redistributed, absorbed into the machinery of financial accountability. Savannah was ejected from the high society she had spent her adult life performing membership in, with nothing but the clothes that had not been classified as proceeds of a crime, a stack of legal notices, and a name that had been thoroughly and publicly connected to a federal fraud syndicate. Her phone contact list evaporated overnight. The women who had admired her bags and watched her live streams and attended her dinner parties blocked her number within hours of the FBI raid becoming public knowledge. The investors' wives, the country club circle, the fertility clinic acquaintances, every social connection she had cultivated through her parents' social capital and Andre's fabricated financial prestige disappeared simultaneously, as though they had all received the same memo. 6 months after the trial, the life Savannah had built, every physical, social, and financial element of it, was unrecognizable. She worked the graveyard shift at a gas station on the desolate outskirts of the city. The scratchy polyester uniform she wore permanently held the smell of stale cigarettes and spilled fuel. Her hair, previously maintained at significant expense in an upscale salon, was pulled back in a knot that bore no relationship to the carefully curated waves she had displayed for her social media audience. Her manicures were gone, replaced by chipped nails and the specific kind of calloused hands that come from scrubbing linoleum floors at 2 a.m. She lived in a public housing apartment where the radiators produced more noise than heat, and the hot water ran out in under 5 minutes. She was managing the residual tax penalties and legal debts Andre had left behind by counting loose change and crumpled dollar bills before buying instant noodles. The people who had constituted her entire social world had blocked her contact information on the day the FBI vehicles appeared in her parents' driveway. She was entirely, completely, and structurally alone. It was a Tuesday night in late November, bitterly cold in the specific way that means winter has arrived and intends to stay. The gas station was empty, The quiet, dead stillness of a place that only exists at that hour because someone is required by necessity to be there. Savannah leaned against the worn counter inside the bulletproof cashier booth, her weight pressed into the surface, fighting the pull of exhaustion that comes from being awake at an hour when the human body has decided it should not be. In the upper corner of the convenience store, a small box television buzzed with the faint static of a 24-hour financial news network playing at low volume. Savannah had learned to ignore it. The financial terminology had become a specific, targeted kind of painful, the vocabulary of a world she had been permanently and irrevocably expelled from. But on this particular night, one word cut through the ambient hum of the refrigerator units and reached her at the counter with the clean, sharp precision of something she had not been able to prepare for. Her own name. No, not her name. My name. She raised her head slowly. On the television screen, in crisp, high-definition framed by the financial news network's authoritative Chiron graphics, was my face. I was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, standing with the relaxed, grounded confidence of someone who has stopped performing authority because she has simply become it, in front of a glass and steel skyscraper in the financial district that reflected the city skyline behind me in perfect, gleaming panels. The news anchor spoke with the tone of genuine professional reverence, the tone reserved for stories about people whose success has moved past admiration into something more categorical. The banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, Apex Estate Liquidators secures $50 million luxury portfolio acquisition. Savannah's hands began to shake against the counter. The anchor detailed the expansion of my company from a boutique high-end liquidation firm into a full-scale real estate and asset management enterprise, operating across multiple jurisdictions. The kind of rapid, strategically driven growth that financial journalists describe with words like unprecedented and visionary. The network ran footage of me moving through a modern open-plan office, directing a team of elite professionals with the quiet, unhurried authority of someone who has never once needed to raise her voice to be taken seriously. Then the anchor announced the crowning achievement: the Global Business Coalition, the recognition, the award. The screen showed me standing on a brightly lit stage in front of a gathered audience of politicians, philanthropists, and industry figures who represented the actual summit of the world Savannah had been trying to perform membership in since the day she understood that Andre's brand of manufactured wealth was her ticket. I was accepting a heavy crystal award with both hands and the slightly small smile of someone who was genuinely, privately pleased, but is too accustomed to achievement to treat it as a surprise. The billionaire, the man whose watch collection I had protected in a titanium vault while the world around it was being demolished, stood directly to my right, applauding with the specific warmth of someone who has extended genuine professional respect to very few people and means it completely when he does. Savannah stared at the screen until the segment ended and the anchor moved on to the next story. Then she looked down at the stained polyester uniform stretched across her chest. She looked at the mop bucket positioned in the corner of the store. She thought about the voice recording, the one I had played for her through the phone, the one that preserved forever the sound of her own voice telling our mother to pull the plug and let me die so that the IVF deposit could be secured. She had said it calmly. She had meant it. She had stood in my kitchen over my dying body and calculated the trade. The sister she had tried to trade for a fertility clinic deposit was now accepting national awards in a charcoal suit in front of an audience of billionaires. Savannah collapsed onto the plastic stool behind the register. She pressed her face into her rough, work-hardened hands and wept. Not the practiced, theatrical weeping she had deployed at family dinners and in federal hallways to generate sympathy, but something rawer and more fundamental than that. The sound of a person who has finally, fully understood the specific weight of what they chose to throw away, and who will spend the rest of their life carrying that understanding in a polyester uniform at 3 in the morning. The golden child sat at the absolute bottom of the world she had helped construct, crushed by the compounding weight of her own choices, while the woman she had tried to erase ruled the skyline above her. The universe had delivered its final, flawless accounting. The panoramic view from my new penthouse encompassed the entire glittering expanse of the city's skyline. Every building, every lit window, every craning tower of glass and steel that constituted the world in which my company now operated with complete, established authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides offered an unobstructed vantage point from which the financial district was visible in every direction, and the effect at night was something that had not yet stopped reaching me in some small, private way that I chose to keep entirely to myself. The chaos and the drywall dust and the ripped-out IV and the hospital parking lot felt, from here, like something that had happened to a different version of a person I used to know. I stood at the window in a tailored silk suit, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, watching the city below move in its perpetual, unconscious rhythm. The private elevator chimed softly across the marble foyer. The steel doors separated and Harrison stepped through, carrying his leather briefcase with the specific energy of someone delivering information he is pleased to be delivering. He was not simply my attorney anymore. He was chief legal counsel for a global enterprise, a position he had accepted with the particular satisfaction of a man who recognizes, very occasionally, that he is exactly where his abilities belong. He crossed the living room and set a thick, precisely assembled stack of legal documents on the custom glass coffee table, with the quiet satisfaction of a person completing the final step of a long and complex process. "The incorporation papers are fully executed," he said, allowing himself a genuine, uncalculated smile that I had not seen from him in the course of many years of professional association. "The Apex Survivor Foundation is federally recognized as of this afternoon. The initial endowment of $10 million has cleared and is fully secured. We have retained 30 litigators across the country, all of them ranked in the top tier of their respective jurisdictions, all of them selected specifically for their willingness to be absolutely merciless when the facts support it." I moved away from the window and crossed to the built-in wine cellar. I selected a bottle of vintage reserve Pinot Noir, the kind of wine that is chosen for a specific occasion rather than a specific preference, and poured 2 unhurried, generous glasses. I handed one to Harrison. The foundation was not a charity project in the conventional sense of the term. It was not about philanthropic image or social credit or tax positioning. It was a declaration of war against a specific category of predator. The kind that operates within families, that uses the language of blood and loyalty and obligation to access and exploit the people most likely to extend those things instinctively and without sufficient caution. The Apex Survivor Foundation existed to provide elite, aggressive, entirely cost-free legal representation to women who were actively being financially exploited by members of their own biological families, forged deeds, stolen trust funds, drained accounts, fraudulent powers of attorney executed against incapacitated relatives. Every legal weapon I had deployed to dismantle Cynthia, Richard, and Andre, every procedural mechanism, every federal statute, every forensic tool Harrison had assembled in the service of my own survival, would now be made available, without charge, to every woman who had been told by someone who shared her last name that she did not deserve to control her own financial existence. "We take our first 5 cases Monday morning," Harrison said, lifting his glass with the particular appreciation of a man who recognizes the quality of what he's drinking. "One involves a brother who has been systematically manipulating a medical power of attorney to position himself to seize his sister's business assets when she undergoes surgery next month. The documentation trail is already substantial." A familiar cold spark ignited somewhere behind my eyes. I took a slow sip of wine, The dark, complex flavor occupied exactly the right space in the moment. Rich, permanent, satisfying in a way that required no performance. "Freeze his accounts by Tuesday morning," I said in the quiet, entirely unhurried voice I use when I am stating a fact rather than giving an order. "I want his financial history audited completely. Every account, every entity, every transaction going back 5 years. I want him facing federal charges before the end of the month." I set my glass down with a small, precise click on the marble counter. We do not negotiate with financial predators. We dismantle them. Entirely. And we do it fast enough that they cannot reorganize. Harrison raised his glass in a brief, silent toast. The specific toast of two people who understand each other's professional register completely and have no need to elaborate it. He finished his wine, collected his briefcase from the table, and stepped back into the elevator. The steel doors closed behind him with a seamless, quiet finality. I was alone in the penthouse. The city spread out below me in every direction, indifferent and vast and exactly as demanding as it had always been. I did not feel a single degree of loneliness. What I felt, standing at the center of a space I had built entirely from the ashes of what my family had tried to take from me, was the specific, irreducible quality of absolute freedom. The freedom that exists on the other side of the worst thing that was ever done to you, after you have walked through it entirely and come out in possession of yourself. I moved through the living room and into the kitchen, an architectural space constructed from flawless black imported marble and brushed stainless steel, designed with the precision of a room that serves a specific and serious purpose. I crossed to the massive seamless slab of black marble positioned directly behind the primary range hood. No visible seams, no visible mechanism, no keyhole, no handle, no indication of anything other than an impeccably selected material covering a structural wall. I raised my left hand and pressed the inside of my wrist against the smooth, cold stone. The microscopic laser embedded beneath the translucent marble surface read the biometric chip implanted beneath my skin. A soft electronic tone sounded. One note, clean and brief, followed by the deep, measured mechanical engagement of military-grade locking bolts, retracting in perfect, sequential synchronization. The black marble wall separated. It divided cleanly down its center and slid apart on heavily reinforced internal tracks, revealing the space I had built into the structural core of the building when I selected this penthouse as the location for everything that mattered most. It was 10 times the volume of the vault I had maintained in my old suburban house, and every element of it had been designed with the same ruthless, protective precision that had characterized every financial decision I had ever made. The interior was lit with crisp, museum-quality lighting that preserved without distorting. Climate-controlled air hummed at a constant, calibrated temperature, protecting the contents from every variable that time and environment use to degrade what is valuable. Rows of reinforced steel shelving held certified gold bullion stacked in precise, ordered columns, banded currency in multiple denominations, and classified corporate bearer bonds. Custom mahogany display cases along the interior walls housed historical antiquities of significant provenance, flawless investment-grade diamonds, and the rarest vintage timepieces in the world, entrusted to my firm by clients whose wealth placed them entirely beyond the reach of the ordinary concerns that drive most human decision-making. This was not a safe. It was a fortress. It was the physical manifestation of every principle I had built my professional life around. The understanding that control over your resources is the only form of protection that does not depend on someone else's loyalty, someone else's goodwill, someone else's decision about whether you deserve to survive. I stepped inside. I let my fingers trail lightly across the cool glass face of the nearest display case, feeling the specific, tangible weight of what was contained within it. not just the assets, but the decade of work and judgment and ruthless, patient preparation that had made their presence here possible. They had tried to strip me to nothing. They had tried to make my suffocation on a kitchen floor the conclusion of my story. A convenient medical tragedy that would release my assets into their hands and remove the one person in the family who had ever posed any threat to their comfort by simply being independent of it. They had stood over me and calculated the trade and signed the documents and gone to the country club. They had been certain. Instead, they had handed me the precise, specific fuel I needed to build something that none of them, not in their most expansive, most arrogant, most champagne-loosened imaginings, would ever have attributed to the unmarried sister who dug through dead people's belongings for a living. I turned slowly in the center of the vault and looked outward through the open door, across the kitchen, through the expanse of the penthouse living room, and out through the floor-to-ceiling glass to the city stretching away in every direction beneath a sky that held no ceiling I could see from here. A slow smile crossed my face, not the performed smile of a woman conducting public business, the private, settled, deeply satisfied smile of a woman who has arrived precisely where she intended to arrive and does not intend to move. Never surrender your future to anyone who claims the title of blood, I said to the city, to the vault, to the version of myself who had once lain on a kitchen floor with no air and no recourse, and nothing but the knowledge of what was hidden in the wall beside her. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. True family stands between you and the world when you cannot stand yourself, not beside the person who intends to harm you, pointing to the signature lines. You owe nothing, not your assets, not your access, not your forgiveness. To anyone who has ever viewed your existence as a financial opportunity to be optimized at the expense of your survival. I pressed my wrist to the interior scanner. The heavy black marble walls began to move, sliding back together on their internal tracks with the smooth, unhurried certainty of something very well engineered, something built to last, something constructed by a person who understood that the most important structure she would ever build was the one between herself and everyone who had ever underestimated her. The marble closed. The seam disappeared. The surface returned to its flawless, impenetrable, perfectly finished facade, hiding everything behind it, protecting everything behind it, containing an empire that would outlast every person who had once been certain it could never exist. The room was quiet. The city moved below, indifferent and vast and entirely alive, and I was exactly where I intended to be. The story of Madison offers something more valuable than entertainment. It offers a masterclass in the specific, unglamorous, essential work of self-preservation in the face of betrayal by the people you were taught from birth to trust unconditionally. The most important thing her story asks us to examine is the assumption that biological connection guarantees protection. It does not. It never has. Society conditions us to believe that blood creates loyalty, that family means safety, that forgiveness of the people who share your last name is not just expected but morally required, regardless of what they have done, regardless of whether any genuine accountability has followed. Madison's experience strips that assumption of every comforting layer and shows us what lies underneath. The understanding that when someone who calls themselves your family views your existence primarily as a resource to be accessed and liquidated at the most convenient moment, they have already made their choice about what you mean to them. Build your vault. Not as a gesture of cynicism, but as an act of profound and clear-eyed self-respect. Financial independence is not a luxury, and it is not selfishness. It is the only form of protection that functions regardless of who decides, in any given moment, that you do not deserve to survive. Control your resources, control your access, control your documentation, your accounts, your assets, and the legal structures that hold them. Not because everyone around you is an enemy, but because the people who mean you harm will always present themselves first as the people who love you most. True family is constituted by presence and protection, by the people who stand beside you when standing costs them something, not by the people who appear when you have something they want. The rest is biology. Protect yourself with the same ruthless precision you would bring to protecting anyone you love. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one who has known, since the beginning, exactly where you keep everything.